This story happened to me 4 years ago when I was in my mid-22s. This whole experience will probably scar me for life, and it's still vividly imprinted in my mind. The day was the 17th of June, and I had the house to myself because my parents were on a 2-week vacation in France. It was sometime after dusk, probably around 9 p.m., and the weather was scorchingly hot. Believe me when I say I was sweating my ass off with just my tank top and shorts on. The heat was so unbearable that I allowed in some fresh air, opening all the living room and bedroom windows, planning on closing them right before hitting the hay. Now, before fast-forwarding, I must mention that I was feeling extremely exhausted. On that same day, I had taken 3 exams in the morning and played a volleyball match in the afternoon. Thus, once I ate my dinner while browsing social media in my room, I collapsed into bed without even realizing it. I woke up at around 3 a.m. to the muffled sounds of thunderbolts and a draft of cold fresh air hitting my face. A strong wind was blowing, and all the shutters left open were noisily banging. Still drowsy, I flicked on the lamp, but the light wouldn't turn on. I checked the plug using my phone flashlight, but everything was fine. I begrudgingly climbed out of bed and looked out my bedroom window. There were menacing rainy black clouds on the horizon. A typical late-night summer storm was approaching. Given that every lamp post on the street was off, I instantly knew there had been a blackout. Phone flashlight in hand, I dizzily headed down the hallway to shut the windows before rain started pouring down. When I got to the last window, though, I noticed the mosquito net lifted up. This struck me as weird since I was quite positive I hadn't left it that way. Getting a little paranoid, I turned behind me to shine the flashlight around the living room and check my surroundings. The furniture was still in place, no drawers or closet doors left open, no decorative objects missing or moved into unfamiliar positions. Everything seemed normal. I briefly peeked my head out of my window to look outside. Trees were swaying in the howling wind, leaves shaking in a frenzy, a powerful display of nature's force, but still nothing remotely suspicious. Maybe the mechanism is faulty, or the strong wind somehow pushed it up. Against my better judgment, I convinced myself it was useless to lose sleep over it. Feeling relieved, I closed the shutters and started walking back to my bedroom, eager to get a decent night's rest. Little did I know that night would be anything but pleasant. I happened to casually turn my head to the flight of stairs connected to the attic when a vivid burst of light flashing from up there caught my eyes. I paid no mind. The attic was adorned with huge glass windows, so it was no wonder to see light spreading across the room. It was probably sheet lightning. I kept walking, subconsciously waiting for the thunder to come, but it never did. I stopped in my tracks. Given that the flash I saw was powerful and bright, the lightning had to be pretty close, so why couldn't any rumbling noise be heard? I started to think maybe it wasn't lightning. What if it was a flashlight? As doubt crept in, my heart began to race. I quickly put 2 and 2 together, and now the strange occurrence of the mosquito net left up made much more sense. The nightmarish realization hit me that an intruder could have broken into my house. At first, I panicked. Did they hear me shutting the windows? Were they carrying any weapons? Did they plan on just robbing my house, or did they also have worse intentions? Normally, I would call my parents to deal with it, but since they were away, it was all on me now. While those sickening thoughts were swirling in my mind, the distinct sound of a doorknob being twisted and turned made me instantly snap out of my catatonic state. I shot my head to face the living room entrance, and through the glass frame, I spotted a shadowy figure just a few inches outside of the front door. There was a person standing there, most likely an accomplice of the guy upstairs. Words are not enough to describe how powerless and defenseless I felt. Despite the overwhelming fear, I did my best to keep my cool, trying to make as little noise as possible. I tiptoed in the direction of the stairs leading down to the basement, which was directly connected to the garage. I figured I could safely escape from there. While I was making my descent down, still using my phone as a source of light, I dialed 911. Speaking as softly as possible, I informed the operator about what just happened. He tried to calm me down and reassured me that the police would be there in less than 10 minutes. He also added that I should lock myself in a safe room and wait for the officers to show up. I was about to reply that I could easily sneak outside through the garage door when, all of a sudden, I lost the call. I immediately checked the phone and realized that down there, I had no signal. As if that wasn't enough, I also noticed the battery was almost dead. Once I reached the basement, I nervously assessed what to do. I could try and find an emergency flashlight, but now I was so close to escaping from the house that I didn't want to waste time rummaging through the drawers. Besides, I was mindful that the intruders upstairs could have heard me. In the heat of the moment, I exited the basement as fast as I could. Nonetheless, while making my way towards the garage door, I got a feeling in my gut telling me I was being watched. I don't even know why, maybe my sixth sense had picked up on something, but I pointed my phone to illuminate the back seats of my car. And there he was, a man's face stuck to the rear-view mirror. A disgusting, revolting face with dead, bulging wide eyes and a malicious yellowish grin spreading across its cheeks. He kept staring at me so intently it almost looked like he was piercing into my soul. He slid his dirty hand against the glass, waving me hello in an unnaturally slow motion. At that point, it happened. My phone battery died, turning off the flashlight and leaving me in total darkness. I felt my heart in my throat. I had never been more scared in my entire life. My whole body was quivering and shaking in fear. When I heard the car door opening, I lost it. I screamed. I screamed like a little girl as I somehow managed to unlock the garage door and bolt outside, climbing up the driveway ramp. By that time, heavy rain had started pouring down. I hopped over the gate and ran to the nearest house, yelling like a lunatic for the neighbors to rush outside. They came out in shock, and I explained to them the whole situation, almost out of breath and soaking wet. In the meantime, I heard sirens in the distance. 2 police cars rolled down the street, and I practically ran into the officer's arms, screaming that there were 3 strangers in my house. 4 agents went into my house, guns drawn, while another one took my description of the events. Those 3 men were all gone, though, and to this day, I don't think they've ever been caught. Some antiques which held some value were stolen, however, I must say it was no big deal for my family. For the remainder of the night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept tossing and turning, jumping at the slightest sounds, ruminating relentlessly on the horrific experience. But I kid you not, another chilling surprise was lying in wait. When morning came, I spotted a small piece of paper sticking out of the edge of my bed. I picked it up and went frozen stiff. The following words were written: "Bye-bye beauty, you look cute when you sleep." I've been a trucker for close to 15 years now. This happened to me in 2017. I was driving an overnight haul through the Mojave Desert in California, headed for a destination in Arizona. I think I was delivering appliances, but I don't really remember. It was pitch black darkness in every direction. The headlights on my semi were really dim at the time, and I'd been putting off getting them fixed forever. Usually, I couldn't tell the difference, but since there were basically no other cars on the road, it was much more obvious. I remember having to strain my eyes every few minutes to make out the road in the distance. That could have been a horror story in and of itself. I was debating pulling over for a couple of hours and waiting for sunrise, but I didn't want to waste my time. I desperately needed the money at the time, so I kept driving even though it wasn't fully safe. I figured since it was basically a straight line, it would be okay. I think it was about an hour before sunrise when I saw something approaching fast in the distance. Worried about hitting an animal, I slammed on the brakes. As my truck screeched to a stop, I realized what was in front of me, a car with its hazards on. The weird thing was that it was in the exact middle of the road, literally on the double yellow. What was even weirder was that the passenger door was wide open. My truck stopped maybe a foot before hitting it. Not to toot my own horn, but I'm a pretty fearless guy, and I know my way around a bar fight. Because of this, I wasn't really scared when I saw the car. I was more curious than anything. I thought maybe someone needed a jump or something, so I reversed the semi and pulled over. I thought about throwing some flares down but decided against it since I hadn't seen a single other car on the road besides this one. I got out of my truck and made my way over to the car. It was a warm, still night. I remember thinking how strange it was that there was almost no wind. It was also really quiet that night. The faint click of the hazards was the only sound in what felt like the entire desert. I got a little closer to the car. I vividly remember that it was a new-looking red Ford Fusion. I approached the car a little cautiously. Like I said, the passenger door was wide open. I walked around the car and stopped in my tracks. It was completely empty. I made sure of it too, checking the back seat and anywhere someone might be lying down. There was literally no one inside. All of a sudden, I was much less sure about the situation. I was expecting someone to need help of some sort, maybe even someone who took a nap in a really dumb spot. I certainly wasn't expecting this, though. The car was literally empty. I cast a few glances over my shoulder, feeling a lot more uneasy now. I kept whipping my head around, looking in every direction. I felt like someone was going to charge me or something. The problem was it was so dark that I couldn't see that far in front of me except for what was lit up by my truck's headlights. It was eerie. I waited a while longer, thinking about getting back in my truck and forgetting about this whole thing. Someone was out there somewhere. Against my better judgment, I decided to keep investigating. I looked inside the car, but everything seemed completely normal. The key was even in the ignition, although the engine was turned off. I got back out of the car and made my way over to the trunk. Might as well have a look, I figured. I went to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. I grabbed the key out of the ignition and unlocked the trunk. Still, though, the thing wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the inside somehow. I opened the back door and tried getting at the trunk through the back seat. To my surprise, it actually opened. There were 3 squished garbage bags back there, along with a rope that was tying the trunk closed. I remember glancing one more time over my shoulder before reaching for them. The coast was clear. I must have been within 5 inches from one of the bags when the loudest gunshot I've ever heard rang out into the night. I slammed my head on the roof of the car in shock. I didn't even think. I threw the keys on the front seat and got out of the car as fast as I could. As I was climbing into my semi, I heard a grungy voice yelling in the distance. He yelled, "Hey," a bunch of times, and his voice seemed to be quickly approaching. I scrambled into the semi and turned it on. I threw it in gear as fast as I could. I remember cursing a bunch of times as the engine initially stalled. And that's when I saw it. As my truck began pulling out, I saw a person standing at the trunk of the car. It was a short, husky guy with red hair. He was wearing overalls and shin-high boots. In his left hand, he was holding a small shovel. In his right, though, was an old-looking hunting rifle. We locked eyes for a few seconds as my truck began to drive past him. He didn't move. I remember him not looking crazy or anything. He had this worried look on his face. As I passed him, he dropped his shovel and started waving his hands. He yelled, "Wait," a few times, but I wasn't staying there another second. As I drove away, I watched in the rearview mirror as he ran after my truck for a few seconds before sprinting back to his car. It was clear he wanted me to stop, but there was absolutely no way I was going to do that. I stepped on it, pushing the semi much faster than I should have. I drove for like 5 minutes and started to think I was in the clear, but then I saw headlights fast approaching behind me. I remember feeling more scared than I've ever felt in my entire life. I called the police and told them what happened to the best of my ability. That's when the car was basically right on my tail. It started honking like crazy at me. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I just kept driving, praying to God he wouldn't try and ram me. After like 15 minutes of this, he cut in front of me and hit his brakes, forcing me to slow down. I was just about to crash into him when finally some flashing police lights appeared ahead. The Ford veered off to the right and sped into the desert, disappearing from sight. I pulled over and waited for the officer to show up. I frantically told him what had happened, but the useless cop decided to get a report from me rather than chase the guy down. I was so pissed about that. I told the guy like twice that he could probably catch up to him if he left now. The cop told me not to worry and that they'd do a thorough search as soon as backup arrived. He sent me on my way and said they'd call me if they ever had an update for me. They never did. None of my buddies have a story this crazy, and I've told it more times than I can count. I know what you're probably thinking. That guy was definitely burying bodies. That doesn't really explain why he had such a small shovel or why he tried to follow me. The bags in his trunk were also too small for that, although some of my buddies think he might have done some dismembering. For my own sanity, I like to think that he was burying some other kind of animal, maybe putting a diseased dog out of its misery or some dangerous snakes. I really have no idea. Either way, I've never been totally comfortable driving through deserts late at night after this experience. My name is Arthur. I've been a trucker for various companies for the better part of 15 years now. Things have become pretty routine at this point. Pick up the goods and materials, verify them for accuracy, and deliver them as instructed. We're not paid by the hour, so efficiency is the most important thing in this line of work. For someone like me who's been doing this forever, I like to think I can outwork all these young guns that are snapping these jobs up. This isn't always great, though. Usually, I push myself to the absolute limit when it comes to functioning on barely any sleep. 4 years ago, I was working for a warehouse based in North Dakota. For anyone who doesn't know, North Dakota is one of the flattest states, which makes trucking a little easier. This also meant that skipping out on a few hours of sleep could mean the difference between employment and getting the sack. It was a chilly Tuesday morning in May. The beginning of the week meant that more loads needed to be shipped, which meant more work for me. I wanted to knock it all out in one shot, so I traced my route into Montana accordingly, planning on not stopping even once to sleep. I hit the road a few hours after lunch, expecting to reach my destination very early the next morning. I pushed the semi as much as possible, doing maybe a couple over the speed limit. It was getting late, and I remember rubbing the crust from my eyelids as the clock ticked past midnight. I was having trouble keeping my eyes open, but I only had about an hour left in this drive, so I gritted my teeth and kept going. My buddy Tristan, who was also a trucker, introduced me to smelling salts when I first started out. If you don't know, smelling salts are basically some kind of crystals in a little bottle. One sniff and you're wide awake. You had to be careful, though. Too many back-to-back uses could be dangerous, or at least that's what Tristan told me. They burn your nose a little bit, but whenever I needed a boost, I'd reach for the smelling salts first. This was one of those times. I took a big whiff and shot my head back, my reflexes taking over. I felt the adrenaline course through my body and hoped the feeling would last the rest of the drive. A half hour shot by, and I was really struggling. I felt myself start to doze off, and the blare of my truck drifting into the shoulder jolted me awake. This was getting dangerous, I thought. I had to pull off. I was all alone on the highway, but there was nowhere to pull off. There were just woods on either side of me. I slowed the truck down, searching desperately for somewhere to pull over. At this low speed, my headlights pierced through the darkness, and I was able to see a lot more. As I looked around, I saw something that confused me. There was a purple dress lying in the middle of the road. What the hell, I thought, rubbing my eyes. Was I hallucinating? I blinked like 6 times just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. It was real. I approached the dress with my truck and stared at it as I rolled by. In hindsight, this should have been more of a red flag, but I think I was just too exhausted to process what was going on. About 200 or so yards away, I passed a pair of shoes. Now I was starting to freak out. What the hell was going on? I passed the shoes, praying to God there would be a place to pull off soon. My old man Finn was a super religious guy, so I clutched his old cross and hoped he would come through for me. A little further up the road, I saw a bunch more random clothing, some of which looked like little kids' clothing. This time, I stopped the truck. The panic started to set in. Something was very, very wrong. I sat in the driver's seat with the truck at a standstill. I was expecting something to happen, but it never did. So I did what my instincts told me to do. I stepped out of the truck and went to inspect the clothing. I still remember the feeling of the chilly morning air piercing my skin, which definitely helped my exhaustion. I approached the pile as cautiously as I could. It was indeed kids' clothing. It looked like there were both boy and girl pieces of clothing in the pile. I looked around into the woods, but I couldn't see much of anything in the darkness. I had my head on a swivel, worried that this was some kind of trap. I decided it was not my business to figure out what was going on, so I made my way back to my truck. Just then, I heard a crunch from the left. I whipped around, trying to see what was there. I stood there, waiting to hear another sound. After about 30 seconds, there was another crunch, but this time from the opposite side of the road. My survival instincts kicked in, and I sprinted towards the truck. I jumped into the front seat, but just before I slammed the door, I heard a child's scream ring out. I froze, my heart bursting out of my chest. I was caught at a crossroads. I wasn't going to fight some random people in pitch-black woods, but I couldn't just abandon some helpless kids either. Before I could make a decision, another almost identical child's scream rang out. Without thinking, I turned the truck on and pointed its nose toward the spot in the woods where I heard the noise. My headlights lit up about 30 yards into the woods. There were 3 or 4 people, one of whom was holding a massive speaker. They ducked behind a couple of trees as my truck lit them up, but I had exposed them for just enough time to make out what they were doing. They hid from the light before I could really make out any distinctive features, but I swear on my old man Finn's grave, they were holding up a speaker, trying to lure me into the woods with a fake kid screaming. I was just in shock. I just sat there staring at the trees those people had just hidden behind. I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I finished dialing, I heard a thump from the body of the truck. Someone had thrown something from the other direction. I was done. I turned back to face the road and slammed on the gas. As I sped off, I could make out a person on the other side of the road. He shouted something I couldn't understand before launching something at the truck that cracked the glass of my passenger side window. I drove the final hour in silence. I was too scared to process what had just happened, but there was no way in hell I was stopping to sleep in those woods. I completed my delivery and then knocked out. I must have slept for 10 hours straight. When I woke up, the first thing I did was call the police, who told me they'd investigate those woods and give me any updates. I then thought about About 7 years ago, on my way home from my parents' house, I experienced something truly terrifying. I was 22, young, naive, and well, dumb. I had just moved into my first apartment, becoming the first in my family to leave our sleepy old train town. I visited home every Sunday to see my family, do laundry, and enjoy Sunday dinner. I lived about 45 minutes up the highway, so I generally headed home by 6 p.m. On this particular night, there was a relentless summer thunderstorm that had been pouring down rain all day. Just as I was packing up to leave after dinner, my cousins dropped in, so I ended up sticking around for a few more hours to visit. I left my mom's around 10 p.m. in the pouring rain. This was the first time after moving out that I encountered something that truly scared me. I never told anyone about this, possibly out of pride. Everyone always gave me trouble about living alone as a single female in a new area. Anyway, here it goes. I left my parents' house around 10 p.m. in the pouring rain. I'm driving down the service road that leads out of town and eventually turns into the on-ramp to the highway. As you leave town, the service road turns into one lane right in front of a quarry train loading station. I'm not really clear on what that place is, but it always gave me the creeps. If you're unfortunate enough to pass through when a train is crossing the road to load, you'll be stuck there for a while. Once the road passes the tracks, it turns back into 2 lanes and goes up a steep hill. As I'm approaching the quarry, I can make out the orange lights on a red cab 18-wheeler sitting in the quarry parking lot. Mind you, it's pouring rain, visibility is low, so I can't make out the trucker until I'm pretty close to him. As soon as I can see it's a trucker, he pulls out into the road. I had to slam on my brakes to avoid hitting the trailer on the back of the truck. I skid around on the road until I regained control of the car. Now I'm stuck behind this dummy who just pulled out without paying attention. I keep my distance because I'm flustered. For the record, my headlights were on, so if he had been paying attention, he should have seen me. Honestly, with the heavy rain and low visibility, who knows? So, I'm behind this guy as we cross the tracks and begin to climb the steep hill. Despite it turning into 2 lanes on the hill, he's driving right up the middle of the 2 lanes. Figuring he didn't realize it was 2 lanes, I just putter along behind him, keeping my distance. As soon as he reaches the peak of the hill and the road levels out, he moves over to the right lane. Yes, finally. So, I move over and begin to pass him. As soon as I get past the front of the truck, he swerves behind me quite abruptly and begins flashing his high beams at me. Usually, when someone flashes their lights behind you in our area, it means turn on your lights, but mine were already on. I checked as soon as he started flashing at me. Weirded out, I put my blinker on and safely changed lanes to get out of his way. He follows my lane change and begins laying on his horn. The honking startled me, and I began to get a lot more flustered. What the hell did this guy want? I moved out of his way and my headlights were on. Why didn't I just speed up and zip away, you may be asking. Well, I grew up in this area. It had been raining heavily all day, and I knew that the service road floods a little in heavy rain, both on the shoulders and in random spots in the middle of the lanes. It's a small Midwestern town, our roads are shitty. I had already skidded and nearly wrecked once, and I wasn't about to floor it on this bumpy, flooded service road and risk wrecking again. There is nothing between that quarry and the highway, just about 4 or 5 miles of wooded area. If I wrecked, it would have been just him and me. This went on for the next 4 or 5 miles to the highway. He began tailgating me in addition to the high beams and honking. Once the tailgating began, I was in tears. I didn't know what this guy wanted from me. I was just trying to stay out of his way and get home safely. That's all I wanted. I changed lanes 2 more times, making 3 total. He followed me from lane to lane. As we approached the highway, I floored it. He couldn't accelerate quickly enough to keep up, and I lost him finally. As soon as I realized I'd lost him and was safe on the highway, I just lost it. I was a hysterical wreck. There is only one exit after getting on the highway to stop in the small town the highway runs through. After that, it's all wooded for a good 30 minutes. Here's a more structured and coherent version of your text with appropriate pauses. I thought about getting off at that exit to calm down and pull myself together, but I just wanted to go home, so I sped right past it. I should have stopped. Once the city was no longer visible in my rearview mirror, I felt much calmer. I managed to scramble my cell out of my purse and put it in my lap just in case. The rain led up to a drizzle the further I went, but I was still pretty on edge. There weren't many other cars on the highway, and most of them were truckers. I'm cruising along in the center lane when the truck next to me in the passing lane begins blaring the horn and moves into my lane, forcing me over to the 3rd lane. He continued moving over, nearly forcing me off the highway. I sped up and changed lanes right in front of him so that I'm back in the center lane. I slowed down until I was in line with the front cab. I double-clicked the home button on my phone, camera shortcut, and rolled down my window, starting to take pictures of the cabbie. I think the flashes made him realize what I was doing, and he began slowing down until he was behind me again. I got a lot of pictures. I sped up and lost sight of him behind me. I was satisfied I managed to get pictures, but I was so angry at this point. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway and waited for him. I just wanted to get behind him so I could get a picture of the license plate and report this. Sadly, he was on to me for sure. I noticed headlights behind me a long way back, but behind me nonetheless, on the shoulder of the highway. I waited, keeping an eye on the truckers passing me by, just to be sure I didn't miss him. I noticed a shadow pass through the headlights of the truck, which spooked me quite a bit. Did he get out of the cab? I didn't stick around to find out. I just took off and got home as quickly as possible. The pictures were a total failure. It was still drizzling. The flash combined with the drizzle just resulted in washing out the pictures. I could see the red cab, but no matter what filters I used, there was no making out exactly what the cab said. Red cab trucker, you're the reason I have a dash cam in my car. All started with a camping trip. Me and my girlfriend, let's just call her Lee, were young and dumb, blissfully unaware of the cosmic curveball life was about to throw our way. Picture this: crisp mountain air, crackling campfire, the Milky Way sprawled across the velvet darkness. Textbook postcard perfect. Except the postcard ripped in half when we woke up the next morning, disoriented, clothes rumpled, and with a gaping hole in our memories where the previous day should have been. We brushed it off as a weird shared dream, a glitch in the matrix, but a niggling unease settled in our gut, a premonition of things to come. Back in the familiar chaos of college life, things got weirder. Lee, normally the picture of health, started experiencing these unexplainable physical oddities: dizzy spells, nausea, heightened sensitivity to light. Then came the bombshell: pregnant. Impossible. She was on the pill religiously. The doctors were as confused as us, their tests revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, as the weeks ticked by, the strangeness intensified. Lee's body became a battleground, her health fluctuating like a runaway roller coaster. One week she'd be glowing, energetic, the next, pale and listless. The baby inside her, meanwhile, seemed to be defying the laws of biology, growing at an alarming rate. The ultrasound session was disturbing. Before Lee and I knew what we were looking at, the technician ended the session. She seemed disturbed, leaving with no explanations given. Both Lee and I were beyond bewildered, bordering on desperation. My countless calls to the specialist's office only yielded the frustrating response: "The doctor is busy. He will call you back." But that call never came. Determined to uncover the truth hidden in those ultrasound images, I took matters into my own hands, parking myself near his car after his workday. The specialist was visibly shocked to find me there. There was no subtlety in my approach. I practically tried to force an answer from him. His bewildered expression shifted as he hesitated before urging, "Tell your wife to get an abortion." That's all I got from him, nothing more. His profound fear caught my attention. I couldn't fathom why he seemed so terrified about our baby's unusual condition. Then, the arrival of a black van nearby intensified his distress. His eyes fixated on it, and the fear seemed to double. As I left, deliberately passing close to the van, the driver's window lowered. Two men in suits and sunglasses shot me an eerie look. As the doctor drove away, the van started up, following him ominously into the unknown. The fear gnawed at me, a constant unwelcome companion. It was this creeping sense of being watched, a feeling like unseen eyes were tracking our every move. Then came that night in the apartment. We woke up, not to the comforting hum of the fridge or the distant sirens of the city, but to a bone-chilling silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of our hearts. In the inky blackness, a presence loomed, unseen but undeniable, radiating an oppressive dread that seeped into our very bones. I am telling you, that night there was more than us in that apartment. Only the Lord knows what that presence was, but it felt otherworldly. We fled that night, seeking refuge in Lee's parents' house, the unease clinging to us like a second skin. That's when I started getting anxiously suspicious about the gap in our memories from the night out camping in the wild. The pieces started falling into place: the strangeness of that event, the unexplainable pregnancy, the constant feeling of being watched. They all pointed towards something not of this world. The doctor's frantic insistence on more tests, his desperate pleas for termination. What further fueled my suspicion was that the doctor always had excuses not to see us or kept the sessions ridiculously short, never giving any clear answers to any of our questions. To myself, I wondered if it was his way to punish me for the time I creeped up to him in the parking lot, or if he was hiding something from us, possibly both. This wasn't a normal pregnancy. This was something else entirely. God knows what. Lee, bless her heart, refused to listen. Motherhood blazed in her eyes, a fierce determination that trumped logic and fear. She was going to have this baby, no matter what the test said, no matter what dark secret it held. Eventually, I decided it's better to let her live her naive dream. Denial can be bliss. I was hoping that she was right. I was hoping it was merely me being paranoid. If the baby was abnormal, we would have it anyway if that is what she wanted. The climax arrived like a sucker punch. Lee went into early labor, the doctors acting frantic, their faces etched with worry. Then came those two men in suits, their expressions unreadable, barring my entry to the delivery room like guardians of some forbidden secret. It was like they were hiding something, something terrifying. When they finally let me in, it was over. The baby, they claimed, died during the procedure. We never saw the body. Some fabricated story about a mix-up, an admin error. A wave of relief washed over me, an undeniable sensation despite the crushing grief clawing at my insides, a hollow echoing in my chest. Lee was devastated. It was slow, but time heals all, and she recovered. The years that followed were a haze, marriage, 3 beautiful, normal children, a life built on laughter and love. We tried to build normally and succeeded to a large extent. And that is our story. Yet it does not end there. Sometimes I wish it did. Ignorance would have been a simpler path. Something was off. Both of us shared nightmares, became our unwelcome souvenir. We never spoke of them, but the knowing glances confirmed our mutual torment. Weeks of normalcy could be shattered by a single morning, both of us awakening as if we'd relived that night in the wilderness every time, both of us at the same time. Its synchronized nature was disturbing. These random nightmares could come at any time. It couldn't continue. When our youngest, barely 5, noticed our erratic behavior, his innocent question cut deep: why are mommy and daddy in such a bad mood some mornings? Desperate for answers, we confided in a trusted psychologist. He suspected suppressed joint trauma and referred us to a hypnotherapist and her practice partner. Our separate but simultaneous sessions with the 2 hypnotherapists uncovered the horror. It all came out, or most of it in any case, or so we believe. Gosh, I think we would have preferred the amnesia. The memories were horrific: the oppressive silence of the woods, the sudden blinding light that filled our tent, the feeling of weightlessness as we were lifted skyward, the colossal metallic craft hovering silently above. Then came the figures themselves, tall and slender with elongated limbs and skin that seemed to shimmer in the otherworldly light, their faces shrouded in shadow, radiating an unsettling calm. Their movements devoid of human emotion, their large almond-shaped black eyes, that is one thing that I can't get out of my mind since the regression sessions. And of course, those creepy 6-fingered hands touching everywhere. The details were terrifyingly clear: the sterile examination rooms, the cold metal instruments, the unsettling hums and piercing screams. We were not the only ones. They forced us apart. They controlled our bodies and movement. We were taken to separate rooms where we endured unspeakable experiments. From me, they extracted samples, a primal instinct telling me it wasn't what later transpired with Lee. For her, they did something far more monstrous, invasive, and unbelievable, manipulating her body and planting the unwelcome seed of that child. We didn't know their motives, but had to endure their cold touch and emotionless indifference. Emerging from the therapist's office, we clung to each other, trembling, tears mingling with the bitter stain of confirmation. Those fragmented memories finally coalesced into a horrifying whole, confirming our darkest suspicions. We weren't just abducted, we were subjects in some experiment, unwilling pawns in their grand design. Regular therapy sessions became our battleground, where we wrestled with the horrific memories and lingering trauma. Despite the semblance of normalcy we rebuilt, the shadows of our experience clung to the corners, whispers of what if clinging to the air. But the heaviest shadow loomed large: the baby, the one we lost. The burden became unbearable, a weight threatening to crush us both. I embarked on a mission for answers, tracking down the retired doctor across state lines in a Sarasota restaurant. Years etched on his face mirrored our own. He unveiled the truth: the 6-digit codes on tiny limbs, the oversized head, the huge black eyes like bottomless voids. Each unsettling detail chipped away at our hope, while the revelation of its survival, spirited away by shadowy figures claiming government affiliation, plunged us into a new abyss of fear and confusion. There's more to the story, secrets too unsettling to share in the open, but one even if the answers lead us deeper into the darkness. My junior year in college, I had a strange experience. First, a few background details. My dorm room was attached to my roommate's, so I had to go out through hers to get to the bathroom or the hallway. She was a light sleeper, but I wasn't the type to be out late, so it didn't matter. I had 2 normal operations in my life at that time and discovered that while under anesthesia, I would wake up briefly toward the end before I was supposed to. If I got a mosquito bite, I had to deal with it for at least a month. I'm not a fast healer. One night, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I woke up briefly somewhere else and then went right back to sleep. In this dream, I looked left, I looked right, and then I passed back out, just like if I was in surgery. I was on a hospital gurney, slightly inclined, facing the wall. There was ambient noise behind me, and the echo suggested it was a very large room. There was nothing sinister about the noises. On either side of me was a row of empty hospital gurneys. At my feet, just to my right, 2 people were having a conversation sitting on a bench against the wall. One was a person in a dark suit, the other, I don't know what it was. It was small, and I saw its hands, which appeared to have darker, grayish skin. They were speaking together, so animated and excited, like 2 old friends who hadn't seen each other in years, and they didn't notice me wake up. I didn't recognize the dialogue. Though I don't speak German, Mandarin, Russian, etc., I can recognize them when I hear them. This language was wholly unrecognizable, yet the person in the suit was fluent. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I said to myself that that was a messed up dream and went to the shower. As I passed my roommate, who was still in bed, she asked, "Where did you go last night?" I thought that was odd. After my shower, I started to put my makeup on and noticed something on my face. I leaned closer and could not believe what I saw, 2 perfectly parallel lines, impossibly thin and impossibly perfect. There was some clear hard gel on the top, and that's what I felt. There was no blood. My own hair was thicker than the width of the cuts, yet I could see down into my skin a little. This was 1996. I had never seen anything like this. These days, I would say it was a laser cut topped with liquid Band-Aid, but neither of those things seemed prevalent in those days. I said, "Okay, there's an explanation. I slept on a staple or a paper clip. I do homework in my bed all the time. I went and scoured my pillow for anything sharp and found nothing. So, I got my sewing needle, a staple from some homework, and a paper clip. I dunked them in hydrogen peroxide and made cuts on my face similar to what was there. Immediately, blood welled up, and the skin was jagged from all 3 objects, and the width of all cuts was thicker than the laser cuts. I determined that nothing in my room could have made the cuts. I didn't have an X-Acto knife, but I knew the blood would well up the same way if I did. I skipped my first class as I tried to figure out what to do. I kept obsessively feeling my face all day, in awe of the perfection of what was there and how it could have come to be. There were only 2 people on campus rich enough to have a digital camera, which meant I would have to borrow a friend's 35mm because I didn't have my own. That meant I would have to explain myself to my friend and possibly the photo shop when the pictures came back. Who would I even give the photos to? Who would I even contact, and what would I tell them? In those days, if you even said the word alien, you were a pariah. After hours of mental debates sitting on the edge of my bed, I gave up thinking about it and finished my classes for the day. I sat on the edge of my bed into the night, debating, unsure of what to do. In the wee hours of the morning, I woke up. The cuts were gone, completely healed, no trace of even a scar. I was disturbed for a few days, but then I eventually forgot about it. A few years after graduating, I decided I was going to have some dental work done and went to 2 different offices to get quotes. They both took a full facial X-ray. I had long since forgotten my crazy dream and the cuts until I sat down across from the first X-ray technician and pointed to a strange thing showing up above my teeth. I asked if I was looking at a mirror image because it was on the same side as my cuts had been rather than the opposite side. No, I was told, the X-ray was actual, not a mirror image, so the right side of the image corresponded with the right side of my face. I pointed to the almost square image above my teeth and asked what that was. "It's just an X-ray anomaly," he said. He didn't seem bothered by it. I figured that meant there was some damage or irregularity with the X-ray plates and let it go. Then I went to the second dentist, an orthodontist, and had another X-ray done. You guessed it, the square was there in the exact same place. This time, I didn't even try to make polite small talk or beat around the bush. I pointed to the square and said, "What is that?" This time, the tech looked at me funny and said, "It's an X-ray anomaly," and she leaned closer and whispered, "We see them all the time," in a way that gave me goosebumps. This was in Spokane, Washington. I didn't know what else to say, so I said nothing. Could it be that whatever negatives or plates or whatever they used for an X-ray were damaged in exactly the same spots and exactly the same shape? Maybe, I guess. I don't know much about X-rays. But after that, I reflected on my situation. I don't feel freaked out, but I think there might be something in my face put there by somebody else. Here's what I know, we do this all the time to other species. We chase them in helicopters, shoot at them with tranquilizer darts, take rectal temperatures, take blood samples, stamp radio tags in their ears with no regard to if it hurts or the trauma of the event, or if their furry buddies will ostracize them later because they have something funky on their ear. In my situation, I was clearly well cared for, if it really happened at all. Someone was there as some kind of representative on my behalf. I was handled in such a way that if I didn't have a weird metabolism, I wouldn't have known what even happened. I never once felt pain. My cut healed instantly. If this is some kind of research-driven radio tag for the purposes of data collection or preservation of habitat or species, like we would do, they did it with far more regard for me than we have for other species on our own planet. I don't know what might happen if I get another X-ray 20 years later. I have tried to look when I go through airport security if anything shows up on the image we see in the booth, but I don't see anything. Surprisingly, I'm okay with this. I think it might just be science and nothing nefarious or evil. I wish my consent to be asked first, but I suppose it's hard to ask for consent when you're not even supposed to exist. When I was 25, I had to move out of state for work. I still work with the company, but I've been able to move back to my hometown and work at the local office here. But at the time, I needed somewhere to live that wouldn't be bank-breaking. I made a posting on basically all the websites for a roommate, Instagram, Craigslist, Twitter, and even on my neighborhood subreddit. I had a guy named Chad reach out to me on Instagram stating he had a room available in his place. I looked at his pictures to see if he looked like a somewhat normal guy, and he did. I was open to the idea of having a male roommate as long as they seemed normal, even though my parents were very against it. Chad and I FaceTimed, during which he gave me a virtual tour of the place. Apparently, he owned the place outright. It was a modest house in the middle of town, only a 15-minute drive from where my office would be. He also seemed pretty nice. I didn't get any bad vibes at all. His price was fair, and his rules were pretty fair too. He said it was available to move in right away, which was perfect. So it was settled. A week later, I had all my things packed and drove down. I met Chad right out front of the house where he greeted me and handed me a key. The first thing I noticed about him was that he was really short, eye level with me. He helped me bring some of the bigger and heavier bags inside. He showed me my room, which was already furnished. He said one of his friends had been living there and recently moved out. I replaced all the pillows and bed sheets with my own, of course. The rest of that day was spent settling in. Chad, I could see, was trying to get to know me and presumably make me feel at home. I didn't get any overly friendly vibes yet. The next day was Sunday. Chad offered to drive me around town to show me around. I wasn't eager to, but I said sure just to get off on a good start with him. He drove us around town, showing me where the good shopping centers and restaurants were. But then he offered to get us lunch. I really wasn't hungry, and he was suggesting a sit-down lunch, almost like a date. I didn't want him to get any kind of wrong idea. I just needed a room. I said I wasn't hungry, and then he right away suggested we go grab drinks somewhere instead. I politely shot it down too, saying I don't drink on work nights. He was being a bit pushy, saying, "Come on, just a couple drinks." I still maintained my politeness and said another time. He gave up and went really quiet all of a sudden, like he was upset. I'll admit, I was slightly uncomfortable, but nothing I couldn't handle yet. That week was my first week at work, so my attention was focused mostly on adjusting to the work week. It wasn't until a few days into the week that I got home, did my laundry, and noticed my hamper full of clothes seemed moved, like the clothes weren't how I remembered they were left. And it wasn't until I was loading the washing machine that I noticed a pair of my underwear was missing. I checked my room top to bottom like 5 times. It was gone. I had a disturbing thought. What if Chad? No, I refused to believe that just yet, and there was no chance in hell I would confront him and ask him that. Still, I was now starting to wish there was a lock on the bedroom door. That weekend, I bought a lockable doorknob from Ace Hardware, and while Chad wasn't home, I swapped out the current doorknob with the new one. Now I could leave the place in peace. I figured I'd tell Chad the next time I saw him. He didn't come home that night, though. He must have been working. His schedule seemed pretty random. That night, I awoke to banging on my bedroom door. It was Chad. He was saying my name, and he didn't sound happy. I checked the time, and it was like 1:30 in the morning. I decided I would pretend I was asleep. I was honestly kind of scared to open the door. I had a feeling it had to do with the doorknob, and I was right. The next morning, I woke up to a bunch of texts from Chad saying, "We need to talk. Be home after work." I simply responded, "Is this about the doorknob?" And he responded back, "Yes." I apologized to him and said I was planning on telling him. He replied back, "It comes off today." I was getting incredibly nasty and weird vibes from his tone. My next response I thought out a little longer and basically said how I hoped he could sympathize and understand that I'm a girl and I just feel safer being able to have privacy in my room. He responded a little nicer this time, but he still basically said no to my request and that the old doorknob needs to go back on. I was confused and upset, but I had to respect his rules. I did also install it without telling him, so I felt like he had a right to be kind of mad. But how did he know I changed it? It's not like I had the old doorknob sitting out in the open. The idea that he tried coming into my room that night kind of scared me. I changed the doorknob back the next day and returned to Ace. This is where things went really downhill, though. There was a knock at the door one day when Chad wasn't home. It was a girl around my age. She asked me if I was living here with Chad, and I said yes. She warned me to get out of there immediately, that Chad has multiple restraining orders against him from different girls and he's known to be a very dangerous, creepy stalker. I was at a loss for words. I asked her how she knew I was here. She said she knew that he was trying to rent his room and that it's not surprising he opted to have a girl move in. She said she saw me moving in and wanted to wait till he wasn't home to come warn me. I thanked her so much. I truly was terrified now. I had already paid Chad for the entire month, and I didn't know what to do. She said she would help me in any way she could. I took her number, and she left. I started packing my things and looking for other places I could move to. I found something across town, a studio apartment sublet for a little more money. I contacted the poster of the ad, and she told me I could move in as soon as possible. Perfect. Now I just needed to tell Chad and get my money back. I started packing some of my stuff into my car, and I texted him that I'd have to be moving out tomorrow as something with my family came up and I needed to go home. He didn't answer. He got back to the house about an hour later and asked me about my text. I came up with my best fake story possible, and he said yeah, he'll give me the money back tomorrow after he goes to the bank. I was super relieved. About an hour later, he knocked on my door and then said, "Did by some chance some girl say something to you?" I simply said, "No, what do you mean?" And he said, "Never mind. It just seems like you're running away out of here for another reason." I insisted that it was purely because of the family reasons. He said okay and left. Sadly, the story didn't end there. I woke up that night and screamed at the top of my lungs when I saw a black figure sitting on the end of the bed. It was Chad. He turned and put his hand on my mouth and went, "Shoo." I said, "Please don't hurt me," and he responded, "Why would I hurt you? I knew someone said something to you. Don't believe what these girls say." I said, "You're scaring me, and this part is still just as insane to me as it was in that moment." He started to caress my leg and he said, "I don't mean to scare you," right after I said he was scaring me. I got out of the bed and ran for the door, and he screamed at me to stop. I ran outside with my phone in hand and called the police. I hid in the bush until they showed up and I explained the entire situation to them. They made Chad come outside and give his side of the story. Basically, I told them I just want to get all my stuff out of the room and I'm leaving. So the cops stayed there as I collected the remainder of my stuff and brought it all to my car. I also insisted on Chad then owing me the money back while the police were there, and he did so. Actually, the whole time the police were there he tried his best to act like some normal dude. I could tell one of the officers then pulled me to the side to tell me that this guy had been arrested before for other incidents with women, but Chad denied ever coming in my room or touching me or anything, so it was all he said, she said. I left the house and went straight to a hotel for the night. The next day I moved into the studio apartment. Luckily, the girl who posted it was able to facilitate my quick move-in. I have never, and will never, live with another man who's not my boyfriend or husband ever again, or just anyone I don't know for that matter. Starting a new job is always a mix of excitement and nerves. When I landed a summer job at a local carnival in downtown LA, I was just looking for some extra cash before my senior year of college started in the fall. The carnival was a typical setup with rides, games, and food stands, but its main attraction was the fun house, which doubled as a haunted house after dark. It was actually a solid structure that I think used to be some old guy's mansion or something. I was assigned to manage the fun house, which was a favorite among the carnival goers. It seemed simple enough: guide the guests in, ensure they have a fun, safe time, and observe them leave. At first, everything seemed straightforward, but then I started noticing odd things. It started with small discrepancies. I'd count a dozen people entering, but only 11 would emerge. At first, I chalked it up to miscounting, After all, keeping track in the chaos of laughter and screams was no easy task. However, as the days passed, the numbers just didn't add up. 7 went in, 6 came out, 10 went in, 9 came out. Was I going crazy? Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it much longer. One particularly busy afternoon, a blonde girl caught my eye as she walked up to the fun house. She was drop-dead gorgeous and almost seemed out of place amidst the childlike atmosphere. She couldn't have been more than a few years older than me. I genuinely had to do a double take. I'm not a weird guy by any means, but I couldn't help but lock eyes with her for a few seconds. She smiled, handed me her ticket, and I directed her into the attraction. After she disappeared into the darkness, I went back to my duties. Time ticked by, and I watched attentively as people entered and exited, sometimes asking me questions and whatnot. Admittedly, I was paying a little more attention to the guests that night, as I wanted to see that girl as she left and maybe work up the courage to talk to her. Pretty soon, I started picking up on the fact that groups of people who had entered after her were beginning to emerge. A few more minutes passed, and I started getting worried. She should have been out by now. Compelled by genuine concern, I decided to abandon my post for a few minutes and go looking for her. I stepped inside and locked the entrance door. I began investigating, navigating the dimly lit rooms and narrow corridors. I moved through the house until I came across something I had noticed during my initial walkthrough, a barely noticeable seam in the wall. I'm not really sure what I was expecting, but curiosity got the best of me. I pressed against the seam, and I heard a distinct click. I played around with it some more, and my jaw nearly hit the floor when I realized it was a hidden door. It swung open slowly, revealing a pitch-black hallway. I stood there in shock. What in the world was this doing here? I was definitely going to have a long conversation with my boss about this. I walked into the hallway with my phone's flashlight guiding the way. I didn't have much brain power to spend being nervous because I was still so shocked about the whole situation. I got to the end of the passage and found another door. I flung it open, and to my surprise, it was a concealed exit that led back to the carnival grounds. I breathed a sigh of relief as this discovery proved I wasn't going crazy. All those people I had noticed leaving the attraction had probably stumbled across that secret door by accident and assumed it was the correct way to go. As I walked back the way I had come, I couldn't help but feel a little bummed out that I wasn't going to get the chance to talk to that girl. I'm not sure what came over me, but I decided to keep exploring the fun house instead of returning to my post. I think a part of me just wanted a few extra minutes of this impromptu break I was taking. I walked through a couple more rooms, and that's when I noticed it. On one of the walls was another faint seam identical to the first one I had seen. I again played with it until it clicked and swung open. I could immediately tell this one was very different. The putrid smell was the first thing I noticed. More concerning, though, was the fact that there was no corridor in this one, but a ladder. A ladder that led downwards. I was more confused than anything. This door was on the ground floor, and I was told specifically that this place didn't have a basement. I debated climbing down, but I just felt awful about the prospect that the girl might be down there. So, against my instincts, I began the descent. The smell only got worse as I climbed down into the darkness. I was expecting to find a basement, but what I found instead was far, far worse. I got to the bottom and pulled out my phone's flashlight. I was frozen in shock. I was literally standing in a tunnel that extended into the darkness. There was literally no way that this was part of the house above. The rational part of my brain screamed to turn back, to forget about it, but the mystery was too compelling. I ventured further, being careful not to make any noise. The walls were damp, and the tunnel was completely silent. As I explored, my flashlight beam fell on something unexpected. A white glittery purse was sitting in the middle of the corridor. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It looked familiar, and then it hit me. It was that girl's purse. I was sure of it. I started to panic. Was she really down here? I doubted there was any way a rational person could find this tunnel and not turn around, but the proof was literally in my hands. My mind started racing. Was she hurt? Lost? And then a more terrifying thought hit me: was she alone? I didn't feel safe anymore, but I was in too deep. Violating every survival instinct I had, I yelled out into the tunnel for that girl. I waited. Nothing. I was just about to shout again when I heard the sound of rapid footsteps echoing through the tunnels. My first instinct was to run. I had every reason to believe whoever was running toward me was hostile. I turned around and bolted back to the ladder. I got halfway up and slipped, falling back to the bottom. The footsteps were basically right on top of me now. I knew I was done for. I braced myself for a fight, and then a voice rang out, a girl's voice. Her voice. She gasped, clutching her side as if in pain. I yelled at her to climb up, but she insisted that I follow her back into the darkness. For some reason, I told her there was no chance I was doing that and basically forced her up the ladder. We got to the top, and I slammed the door shut. I asked her how in the world she ended up down there, and she couldn't really give me a straight answer. She kept saying she didn't really remember how it happened, just that she suddenly realized she was underground. She said she started hearing things moving in the dark and that there were voices calling to her. I didn't know how to process this. I asked her if someone had guided her down there, and she said she didn't remember. The weirdest thing about her story was that she was looking at me with this blank stare that genuinely freaked me out. I basically interrogated her about why she told me to stay down there, but she didn't answer. I had had enough. I wanted to get as far away from this person as possible. I called the police, but she opted to leave the fun house before they got there. I never saw her again. The police investigated, and what they found was actually insane. Apparently, this house had been some sort of safe house during Prohibition in the 1920s. As such, it had a bunch of secret passageways that led to a section of the underground Prohibition tunnels that hadn't been discovered. The owner claimed he had no idea about the house's history, but I was skeptical. I quit my job and got as far away from there as possible. I still have so many questions. Did the owner know about this? Was that girl almost kidnapped? Had someone knocked her out and taken her down there or something? Was she part of the whole thing? I feel like there are a number of explanations for what happened to me, but all of them are equally terrifying. Ever since I was a kid, I loved carnivals. The lights, the games, the unpredictable joy of it all. I know lots of people find them weird and childish, but not me. Growing up in a small town in Indiana, it's not like there was a whole bunch to do. So whenever the carnivals would roll through town, you best believe I was spending as much time there as I possibly could. It's been over 20 years, and I still enjoy the atmosphere of a local carnival. Despite what I'm about to tell you, I think my love for carnivals is something I'll never lose. I was like 9 or 10 when this happened, and I was a kind of nerdy kid growing up. In the days leading up to the spring carnival, I found myself in the library reading up on whatever I found interesting at the time. For whatever reason, I wound up in the history section. I remember the books being literally caked in layers of dust. That's how long it had been since they were even touched. I was flipping through a book on the history of our town when a small, faded slip of paper fell out from between the pages. Confused, I leaned down to pick it up. To my pleasant surprise, it was a ticket for our local spring carnival, dated over 15 years ago. The odds of something like that happening had to be extremely low. I was ecstatic. This ticket would make a great addition to my miscellaneous collection back home. What was even cooler, though, was the fact that the date on the ticket was just 2 days away, when the carnival would certainly be in town. As I predicted, the carnival cruised into town the next morning, so I figured, why not use the old ticket just for laughs, to see what the booth attendant would say. I wanted to get it punched anyway. The next evening, I headed to the carnival with the ticket safely tucked away in my pocket. As I approached the entrance, the carnival seemed just as lively as ever, the air filled with the scent of cotton candy and popcorn. I pulled out the ticket at the gate, handing it over to the guy at the booth. His face changed the moment he saw it. He went pale, his eyes widening slightly before he masked his reaction with a forced smile. It was honestly a little creepy. Enjoy your evening," he stammered, handing me back the ticket without punching it. I was so weirded out by his reaction that I forgot to ask him to punch it. I shrugged it off, though, thinking maybe he was just new and confused about the old design of the ticket. I wandered around, played some games, and enjoyed a funnel cake. The night was perfect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I felt eyes on me, observing. Maybe it was just paranoia. I tried to ignore it at first, but I kept noticing the carnival employees giving me weird looks. After a while, I got fed up and decided to ask one of the older game operators about it. I found a kindly-looking elderly man running the ring toss booth. I showed him the ticket, and unlike the booth guy, he didn't even try to hide his shock. He glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Young man, where did you get this?" he asked. After telling him where I found it, I started feeling uneasy about the whole situation. Maybe I should have just kept the ticket at home. "You found something you weren't meant to find," the old man started, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This ticket, it's part of a story that the folks around here don't talk about much. About 15 years ago, something terrible happened during the carnival right here in this town." He paused as if weighing whether to continue. "There was a young worker, name of Win, nice kid, everybody liked him. He was responsible for one of the rides. I can't remember which. One night, he just disappeared, vanished without a trace. The police found his wallet, but there was nothing in it except a ticket that looked an awful lot like this one," he said, gesturing towards my hands. The atmosphere around us seemed to drop a few degrees. He continued, "They searched everywhere, even drained the local pond, but no sign of him. After that, strange things started happening every time the carnival stopped here, accidents, things going missing, odd sightings. People said it was Win trying to come back, or something worse that took him. I could feel a chill running down my spine, but a part of me was skeptical." "And you believe that?" I asked. The old man shrugged. "I've seen enough to keep an open mind. But the point is, the ticket you found might stir things up. It's best you get rid of it. Leave it here." He then motioned for me to give it to him, but I was reluctant. I looked down at it, reading it over again as if there was some kind of secret I was missing. How could a ticket be the cause of all that? I questioned, still not fully buying it. The look in his eye got darker, his tone switched almost as if he were angry. "Give it here," he told me, almost in a growl. I considered it but concluded that some stupid story wasn't worth giving up such a cool souvenir. I told him no, and he actually sprung up with a quickness that startled me. He reached for the ticket, his fingers grazing my hand. I jerked back instinctively, clutching the ticket tighter. The old man's expression morphed into something desperate, almost predatory. "You don't understand," he hissed, his eyes darting around as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. I backed away towards the tense exit, my heart pounding. "I think I should go," I stammered, turning to lose myself in the crowd. Behind me, I could hear his calls, a mix of pleading and warning. I didn't care what he was saying though. I let the bustling crowd around me drown his voice out. My mind was racing, not even about the ticket, but more so his aggressive reaction. The joy of the carnival had been spoiled. I left earlier than planned, the ticket burning a hole in my pocket. Over the next few days, my luck seemed to turn sharply. I missed catching the school bus, scraped my knee pretty bad in a bike accident, and worst of all, my best friend accused me of stealing his favorite baseball card, something I would never do. Things got worse than that, though. I remember coming home one night to my mother in tears after losing her job. My brother broke his leg skateboarding the next week, and our beloved family pet, Bean, also passed away a few days after that. It was like a dark cloud had settled over me since that night at the carnival. I couldn't help but remember the old man's warning about the ticket stirring things up. It seemed ridiculous, but then again, so was the string of bad luck that followed me. My dad laughed when I told him about my theory. He told me that there was no such thing as ghosts and that I shouldn't be so superstitious. One rainy afternoon after school, after a particularly tough day where I had forgotten my lunch and had to go hungry, I pulled the ticket out. I stared at it, this small piece of paper that had brought nothing but trouble. Feeling a mix of anger and fear, I decided I had had enough. I grabbed my raincoat and boots and trudged out to the creek that ran behind our house. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest as the rain soaked through my hair. Standing at the creek's edge, I took one last look at the ticket before tearing it into tiny pieces and watching them get swept up by the current. It's just a piece of paper, I thought. Things started to look up after that. My friend found his baseball card and apologized to me, and we became friends again. I didn't miss the bus a single time that school year. My mom got a better job in the next couple of days. Whether it was all a coincidence or that ticket really was cursed, I couldn't say, but one thing was for sure, I learned to be more careful about what I picked up and brought home. I don't believe in the supernatural, even after all this stuff happened to me. My parents liked telling me that I imagined everything because I was so young. It's still hard to fully explain it, but I've long since accepted it as one of those weird coincidences that you just can't explain. I hate carnivals. I think they're disgusting and filled with children. I hate the food, the games, and the smell of it all. My hatred of carnivals is probably biased, though, and mostly based on what I'm about to tell you. A few years ago, I was dragged to our local carnival by my younger sister. I obviously wasn't going to be rude and not go, but I wasn't looking forward to it. After a while, my sister got bored and wanted to leave, so I called my mom to pick us up. I actually opted not to go with them as I was in the midst of a fight with my dad and didn't want to go back home until he was asleep. I told my mom I'd walk home later, so she picked up my sister and left. The carnival was honestly a little pathetic. There were far fewer people there that night than I remember there being in previous years, and everyone looked miserable. I figured I might as well walk around a little to try and get my money's worth. After all, I had paid for a ticket out of my own pocket. I decided to step into the fun house as I figured that would at least be a little cool. I was expecting there to be a ton of people in there, but it was completely empty. There was literally not a single other person in there as far as I could tell. I had never been inside a fun house alone before. People don't realize how important the laughter and talking is to the atmosphere. Without it, you're basically just standing there in silence, surrounded by a bunch of weird mirrors. It was honestly a little creepy. I shrugged my shoulders and figured I might as well walk through it. Admittedly, I did get a pretty good laugh out of the distorted mirrors. I think I was like halfway through when I noticed something odd in one of the reflections. To my left, there was a head that seemed to be peering at me. I only saw it for a split second, but it was a bald guy with really sunken eyes. I whipped around but didn't see anyone. To be completely honest, I had no idea where he had even been standing. Since there were mirrors all over the place, he could have literally been anywhere. I thought it was especially creepy since I didn't hear the funhouse entrance open. He either snuck in behind me or he had already been inside. I kept walking, going a little more quickly now, and then I saw him again out of the corner of my eye. He had this deranged smile. This time it was the exact same face, I was positive. I tried to figure out where he was standing, but the reflections were too confusing. I yelled for him to get lost but got no response. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. I picked up the pace again, but it was difficult trying to navigate this maze of mirrors, and I kept hitting dead ends. I started sweating, constantly looking over my shoulder every few seconds. A few minutes later, I turned a corner after hitting another dead end, and a hand reached out from behind one of the mirrors, grabbing my wrist. I screamed, cursing at the guy to let go of me, but he held firm. I punched his arm, forcing him to let go. I fell to the ground in the fray and saw the creepster in his full form. He was wearing all gray, had a bit of a gut, and a tired, sunken face. I jumped to my feet before he could reach for me again and sprinted back the way I came. I don't know if it was survival instincts or not, but finding my way back to the entrance was somehow easier with the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I sprinted out of the fun house and caught my breath. I reached into my back pocket, and a horrifying realization hit me: I didn't have my wallet. I must have dropped it when I fell. There was no way I was going back in there. After running to the nearest staff person, I told them everything that happened. She seemed confused and told me that the fun house was closed to patrons that night. I was horrified. They called the police and searched it but found nothing, not even my wallet. I felt like such an idiot. I told them that that guy was probably an ex-employee with a key, but they shrugged off my theory and told me to go home. So reluctantly, that's what I did. It's not like I had gotten hurt or anything. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, but I can't. A week later, my girlfriend called me one night in a panic, frantically screaming into the phone about something terrible that happened. Apparently, someone had been texting her phone pretending to be me and convinced her to drive out to this remote location to help me change a tire. Thankfully, she decided to bring her dad even though the guy told her to come alone. They pretty quickly realized what was going on when the car parked in the lot wasn't mine. Her dad stepped out of the car, and 6 dudes stepped out of the car in front of them. He sprinted back to the car and hightailed it out of there before those guys could catch up to him. The whole thing made sense. I did have my girlfriend's number written down on a slip of paper in my wallet, which explains how he got her number. Both of us changed all our contact information, and it's been a month without incident. I really don't know how to feel about this whole ordeal. I think I'm just going to try to block the memory out of my head. This is a story I'm not proud of, mostly for my naivety. When I was in middle school and early high school, I didn't know how to talk to girls at all at school, but that's a lot of boys in middle school. I wasn't shy in general. I had friends and did normal things an 8th grader would do. I just had never kissed a girl or anything. Some of my friends at the time claimed they had already gone further than that with girls, and I was starting to feel pressure. But I was still having trouble approaching girls in that way. The mentality went from boys making fun of girls to suddenly liking them in a matter of like a year. I was a pretty big gamer in middle school and early high school. This was when I was in 8th grade. I was like 13. My voice was still probably a bit prepubescent sounding. It was 2009. I played a lot of console games and computer MMORPG games. My favorite console games at the time were GTA 4 and Call of Duty, and my favorite computer game was this MMORPG called Ganu. It was this online game where you would level up by killing monsters, and the more you leveled up, the higher level monsters and hunting grounds you'd be able to tackle. The online community in this game was very active, and there were tons of players. My older brother used to play it a little bit too. I played it more for sure though. I was in a guild and town and everything. I don't remember how it happened, but I befriended this female player who was a higher level than me. Her username was Pokimane. Anytime I'd sign in and she was on, she'd message me and vice versa. We would join parties together, which meant we'd share EXP on whatever monsters we killed, and we just chatted for hours. She knew a lot about me, including my age and my town, and some personal family details she would open up to me too. Eventually, she told me her name was Karina. It was weird feeling such a connection with a girl when really, I knew nothing about her appearance or her voice. It truly was like having a pen pal, but better. It was interesting enough that we both lived in Texas state. She lived about an hour from me. After a few weeks, or maybe even a month, we started talking about maybe meeting one day. To do this, though, we'd have to exchange numbers. At the time, I didn't actually have a cell phone yet. I only had an iPod Touch. However, I was able to download a texting app that allowed me to send messages to people with cell phones. Through this app, I was able to send her a picture of myself. It was definitely this cringy 8th grade boy selfie of me trying to look good looking. She called me cute, and then she sent back a picture of herself. She looked a couple of years older than me, like 15, which was the age she told me she was. Based on the picture, I found her very attractive. This was around the time our messages became more flirtatious and romantic. But we were both minors, so neither of us could just drive an hour away. However, she apparently had a solution for this. She told me her sister had friends that lived around me, and she could probably get a ride to me. This was exciting news for my little 13-year-old self. I wanted to wait for a day and night when my parents wouldn't be home, so I'd have the house to myself. This was about a week later, I believe. My parents were going to the Hamptons for the whole weekend, so it would just be my brother and me home. My brother was 18, so I asked him to please just go out for the night with friends so that I could be alone with Karina. I gave Karina my address and told her to come that Saturday whenever she wanted. She said she'd be coming a little later, like at night. She didn't give me an exact time. At that point, we still had never spoken on the phone. I still hadn't heard her voice. I was so nervous all day that I couldn't even play video games. I was busy cleaning my room, making things look cool, fixing my appearance, and even rehearsing things to say in the initial moments of meeting. Then I got a message from Karina saying she's here. I sprang up and ran to the front door. I looked through the peephole and didn't see anyone. She then said, "You can come out to the front door." I opened the door and stepped onto the front porch. I looked around, and the street was dark and quiet, no cars, no people. I went back inside and shut the door. I messaged her back saying, "I don't see you." She replied, "Oh, I must have the wrong house. Give me a minute." That was a bit weird. I locked the door and sat on the living room couch, nervously waiting and playing games on my iPod. I got a message from her again. She said she's here and to come outside. I replied, "Ring the bell so I know you're at the right house." Then the doorbell rang. My nerves really set in. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and didn't see anyone. I said, "Karina." Through the peephole, I saw a hand reach towards the door and knock. I said, "Karina," again as I kept looking through the peephole. Everything felt like it instantly crumbled on top of me as this bald, creepy-looking short guy stepped in front of the peephole and then said through the door, "Hey, it's Pokemon. I want to talk." I ran away from the door with my hands over my mouth, truly speechless. The person I'd been talking to all this time was a creepy grown man. I was disgusted and scared. I went to call my brother's cell phone. He didn't pick up. The doorbell kept ringing. I went to my bedroom and locked myself in. I held the house phone in my grasp, considering calling my parents but too embarrassed to do so. My room was the only other room in the house with the lights on. I have a big window in my room that overlooks the whole side yard of our corner house. I turned off my lamp and slightly kinked the blind just a crack, and I saw that guy on the other side trying to look in. He started to knock on the window and said through the closed window how much of a connection we clearly have and that we could at least be friends. I responded with nothing. I called my brother again, and he picked up this time. I said, "Please come home right now." The Karina person was a grown man the entire time, and he's at my window right now. My brother's always been pretty big, even as a teenager. I'd feel safer with him being here. He said he was coming home with his friends right now. We stayed on the phone so I could tell him if anything happened. I ran to my parents' bedroom upstairs and hid there. The man was blowing up my message app, saying he would like to talk and that there was a reason he had to lie about who he was. When my brother got home, he told me he saw the guy outside. My brother and his 3 friends confronted the creepy short man outside. I went outside then to watch the 4 of them intimidate the man, calling him a sicko. The man's defense was that he was concerned for my well-being, inviting strangers from online over, and that this was supposed to be a learning lesson. I refuted this claim by asking him why he would say that we could be good friends at my window when my brother and his friends started pushing the man. He started quickly walking to his car. My brother kicked the guy's tail light while one of his friends threw a rock at his window. He sped off down the road, never to be seen again. This was humiliating and disturbing, but at the same time, I was really grateful for my brother and his friends coming to my aid. They potentially saved me from a seriously sick creep breaking into the house. It's still painful and uncomfortable realizing all that time I spent opening up to who I thought was a girl my own age on a game was some creepy grown man with a different agenda. When I was 18, I was very immature and naive. I was kind of a jerk when I was on the road, honking whenever I got impatient, borderline cutting people off. Looking back now, it was very stupid. If I ever have kids, I'll be that much more strict with them as far as their driving. That being said, I did drive a lot for someone my age. I went away to school 5 hours away from home. No matter what day of the week, traffic always gets atrocious the closer I get to home. So during breaks, I'll drive home at night to avoid this. What goes from a 4 to 5 hour drive down to a 3-hour drive? It was the beginning of winter break as the fall semester just ended. All my friends left for home on the same day. I just waited till later on in the night to head out because there's nothing I hate more than traffic. I used to drive a Mazda 3 that I would beat the ever-living crap out of, and admittedly, I used to be known for driving my car to a near-empty tank consistently. People would comment on it whenever they'd be in the car with me, and I'd always assure them that the car would still have at least 30 miles to go even after the needle would hit E. I found out the night I was driving home from school that I was wrong. I was only like an hour into my drive on the interstate. The needle was on E, and I was pushing my luck waiting for a gas station sign instead of looking up the nearest one on the map. The car started making these weird sounds suddenly and jolting, and that's when I realized I may have actually run the tank empty this time. I got off the first exit ramp and hoped it would lead right to a gas station. This exit was dark though, with no street lights, and there were just woods on either side. I was scared to slow down and lose my speed because I didn't know if I'd have enough gas to find a gas station. I blew through the stop sign at the end of the ramp and made a sharp left turn on the intersecting road, which was another dark road surrounded by woods. I was screwed. The car eventually came to a stop, and the engine died. Things only got worse when I took out my phone and saw I had no bars. I have T-Mobile, which is the worst possible reception anywhere far from a major city. I tried calling 911 because I was stupid and thought that 911 works even without reception. Of course, it didn't. I was terrified because I didn't know what to do. I turned on my hazard lights and just waited for someone to pass by. It was a long time before I saw headlights approaching. When I did, I flashed my headlights at them, and they passed me, made a U-turn, then pulled up on the grass behind me. I didn't know who was getting out of that car, though, and I was an 18-year-old defenseless girl. I just cracked the window down a little bit as this man approached my car. I told him I needed help. I ran out of gas. He offered to give me a ride to the nearest gas station. He was this bald guy with glasses on. He kind of looked trustworthy. I had no other apparent options but to accept his offer. I got out of the car and followed him to his car, making sure to lock my doors first. His car was a black Honda, year probably a 2010. It smelled funky in his car. I couldn't pin what the smell could be, though. He banged another U-turn and started driving in the direction he was driving before. He made conversation with me, asking where I was from and basic questions. I was honest with him that I was driving home from school. He said he lived in the area and that they don't get too many out-of-towners getting off the interstate for this quiet little town. The route we were taking lacked any buildings anywhere. It was just woods everywhere. I asked if he knew of any gas stations, and he said yeah, just a ways up the road. I started hearing bumping and thumping coming from the back of the vehicle. It sounded like the trunk. At first, I thought it was maybe just bumps in the road or a loose object in the trunk. He seemed to keep talking like he wouldn't stop. Finally, we got to a sort of town-looking area. There were some lights and buildings at last, a diner, and a few small houses. There was a red light at the first intersection since I got in his car. We came to a stop, and for the first time, there was silence. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone screaming in the trunk, followed by thumps and bangs. I looked at the man, who looked at me. In a split second, I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened the door, and ran while at the same time, he tried grabbing me and pulling me back into the car. I heard him get out as well, but instead of chasing me, he ran to close his passenger side door. Then I heard him floor it down the street. I ran into the diner and asked for help, making a scene. I used their phone to call 911. I waited there, and it became this whole huge thing with multiple police showing up to the diner to take a report. Given the gravity of the report that I was making, that I heard someone in the trunk of the car, they had to get every last detail from me about the man's car, his appearance, and where he picked me up. I was also given a ride back to my car so that they could also include the pickup location in the report. They also helped me get a hold of AAA, which eventually would come to my location to fill my car with gas. This was overall the scariest experience of my life. I was shaken to the core the whole rest of the ride home. I hope they found that man. I hope whoever was in that trunk is still alive today. For all I know, that man could have been bringing me to his house or somewhere else, and I was just lucky I had a chance to get out at that red light. I live in Burke County, North Carolina, in Morganton. I'm used to the quiet lifestyle that comes with living in a rural place. You get some weird characters here and there, but it's usually nothing too bad. I own a nice plot of land with my husband. My work schedule fluctuates. Sometimes I work days, sometimes I work nights. This happened on a night that I was on my way home after a night shift, so it had to be like 4 a.m. My phone was almost dead. I was hungry. I was tired, and I just wanted to get some food and head home. I stopped at the gas station to get $10 worth of gas and also a packaged sandwich, which I proceeded to eat inside the gas station cafe. Some sketchy guy was eyeing me for a little until he left the building without buying anything. After eating, I went outside to fill up the gas and then got back in the car. The smell of gas was extra pungent for some reason. These roads are very dark and twisty at night, so I was driving slow, especially since I was tired after a long day of work. Then something unexpected happened. The needle on the gas gauge suddenly dropped to E, and the low gas light came on and beeped. I had no idea what was going on. I'm not a car person and I'd never run out of gas before this. Plus, the needle just suddenly dropped. I thought at first that the computer was glitching, so I pulled over and restarted the car, but the needle was still on E. I tried to continue driving, but the engine died. I started having a panic attack. I called my husband first thing, and thank God he picked up. I asked him how did my car run out of gas after I just filled up, and as I got out of the car, I smelt gasoline. I told him this, and he said it sounds like I have a leak. He told me he'd head right over and he'd call our roadside assistance company. But then I heard a car coming with no headlights, and suddenly it stopped not far behind my car. I suddenly thought to bring up that sketchy guy who was watching me at the gas station and asked my husband if there was a chance he did something to my car. My husband's tone suddenly changed to sounding more concerned and worried. He said yes, there's a chance that he may have cut my fuel line. I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was I needed to run. I took my keys out of the ignition and shut the door and locked it so that the headlights would turn off. My phone was on like 2%, so I told him to text me when he's close. I ran off the road and towards the first house I could find. I ran down the long driveway and up the property to the front door. All the lights in the house were off. I still rang the bell multiple times anyway. Eventually, a light turned on and then the door opened. A man in his 60s opened the door. He looked like he was just woken up. I asked him to let me in to hide and charge my phone. After a bit of explaining, he opened the door fully and let me in. I asked him for an iPhone charger, and he said he'd go look for one, then asked me to take a seat in the living room. I sat down, still in my nurse scrubs, feeling a mix of emotions. The man called out from the kitchen asking me if I wanted some water. I said yes, please. Little did he know, I saw his reflection in a mirror in the living room that gave visibility into the kitchen. I saw him fill a cup with water, then I know for a fact I saw him drop something into the water. He walked out of view of the mirror, but the faucet was still running. It ran for a solid 30 more seconds before he turned it off. He came back into the living room with a glass of water and handed it to me. I thanked him, and he sat down and just looked at me, then asked me to explain the situation again. I replied to him, I just really need a charger so that I could contact my husband. He said all right and went upstairs. I checked my phone, and it was on 1%. I used that remaining battery to send my current location to my husband just in case. I then smelt the glass of water, and although it didn't smell like anything, I knew he put something in it. Now I had to make the decision of whether I should leave or not. On one hand, I needed to charge my phone badly. On the other, I was 99% sure he did something to this water. I heard him walking back down the stairs, and he said he doesn't have any iPhone chargers since he has an Android. After he said this, I got up and walked straight for the door. I'm not an idiot. Once outside, I ran back down the driveway to the road. I felt like throwing up. I couldn't believe two separate potential incidents from two different men happened in one night. I crept along the side of the road behind the trees. I took out my phone and sent my updated location, and right around now was when my battery died. I waited until I saw the familiar headlights of my husband's truck. I went out waving my arms, and thank God it was him. I got inside the truck and let all my emotions out, crying to him about what I just went through. He brought us to my car, and there was no longer a car behind mine. My back window was shattered, though, and it appeared someone had gotten into the back seat, but nothing of high value was left in my car to steal anyway. My car battery was also now dead. When I told my husband about the man who tried to potentially drug me, he was so furious he wanted to go break down his door. But I told him no, let's just wait for the tow truck to come. We waited quite a while before it came. My car was towed to my dealership, where they would take the car in the next day. My husband was right. My car was vandalized, and the fuel line was cut completely. Thank God I was off the next few days because I needed some time to mentally recover from this night. The idea that twice in one night I was almost a victim of some sketchy men, I just couldn't get over. This happened way back in 2006. I was 17 and living in Uvalde, Texas, a very low-income neighborhood, the kind you'll find sprawled out all over the place in rural Texas when you're not right outside of a city. The closest city to me was San Antonio. I was going to some local community college because that's all my parents could afford for me. One of my best friends from high school, Bodie, moved to San Antonio to go to San Antonio College. He was living in some small apartment a little outside of the city with a roommate. His girlfriend would also often stay with him. Since the city is only really an hour and a half away, I would visit him all the time. He invited me this one weekend to come crash for the night, so I took my trusty old 1995 Toyota pickup truck. Just kidding. The thing was a piece of crap. The gas gauge didn't even work on it. I'd have to always just keep track of when the last time I filled the tank up was, then reset the trip mileage. I took Route 90, which was a straight shot from Uvalde to San Antonio. I was on the road at like 2:40 p.m. on a Friday, and there was no traffic at all. I got to Bodie at a reasonable time. His girlfriend wouldn't be getting there until tomorrow, so tonight we were going to go out. We stopped at a liquor store and drank in his apartment for a while with his roommate. Then the three of us went to this dive bar that would kind of look the other way with fake IDs. That was basically our night. We got back to their apartment around 2 a.m. after getting food. I slept on the couch. The next day would have almost been the same thing, but Bodie and his girlfriend were having issues all day. As the two of them got drunker as the night progressed, she started yelling at him in front of me, and it got really awkward and uncomfortable. I didn't really have much to drink that day because I was already iffy about staying the night with her there. I eventually decided I would just head back home. I said goodbye to everyone and started my journey home. It was very late at night. I want to guess midnight, maybe a little earlier. Route 90 was deserted at this time, so I would fly for my pickup standards. But suddenly, the engine started sputtering. I felt my heart completely drop as I realized I forgot to fill up the tank. I slowed down, but it was too late. The engine cut. I pulled to the side of the road and tried starting it a few times, but it did no good. I took out my cell phone, which was equally as shitty as my truck, and tried to get a signal. No shot. I couldn't even call for help. I had to just put my hazards on and hope a good Samaritan would pass. You wouldn't believe how long I sat on the side of the road before seeing headlights. I waved my arms as the car approached, but it zoomed past me, ignoring me. This happened again after another 10 minutes or so. I was starting to feel hopeless, like maybe I should just sleep in my car and wait till sunrise to get help. So that's what I was going to do. I got inside my car, took the key out of the ignition to cut the battery, and just angled my seat back to go to sleep. I would hear the occasional car zooming past, like once every 10 minutes, but it didn't feel worth waving people down in the dark. It seemed sketchy for myself and to the people in the cars. But when I was starting to actually drift away to sleep, a car door closing from behind me woke me up. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a car pulled up behind me with its headlights off. I turned around now to get a better look. There was some big pickup truck, but I couldn't see anyone inside of it, nor did I see anyone outside of it. Maybe someone pulled over to help. I got out of the car and said, "Excuse me," to no response. I walked closer to the truck just to confirm no one was inside. Then I walked back to my car. This was weird. I looked towards the trees on the side of the road. Maybe someone was pissing in the woods. I went back inside my car and locked the door. This was just too weird. Suddenly, there was a tap at my window. I jumped. I looked to see a man looking down at me into the car, smiling. I didn't do anything yet. He said, "Hey, buddy, need a hand?" I lowered the window a crack and said, "Hey, I ran out of gas." The man said, "That's quite the predicament. Step out and give me a hand with this real quick." When he said this, I thought he meant help him with a gas jug to fill up my tank or something, honestly. So I stepped out of the truck and shut the door, expecting him to lead me to his truck. But he stood there, looked down at me because he was much taller, still smiling, and said, "I need you to empty your pockets, please." It took me a second to process what he meant. I was literally a broke college student driving a piece of pickup truck. I wasn't about to get robbed of the only cash I had in my phone. I ran for it in the direction of the trees. I'm small but fast. I turned around and saw he was chasing after me. Once I made it into the trees, I zigzagged all over the place until I seemed to lose him. Then I crouched behind a big tree to catch my breath. When I heard him approaching closer, I quieted my breath. I heard him say out loud, "I'll kill you, you piece of." I don't know if he was just saying it out loud out of anger or if he wanted me to hear it, but I was too scared to move. Even after I heard his footsteps move away, I didn't move. In fact, I stayed in this position the rest of the night, eventually laying behind this big tree up until dawn. I went back over to the highway to my truck, and the truck behind me was gone, but my truck's doors were both open. I found that my glove box had been gone through and completely emptied of anything somewhat valuable. My flannel hoodie was also taken, which had something in the pocket, I'm sure. I finally managed to wave down a good Samaritan, and he gave me a ride to the closest gas station. I bought a fuel can, filled it with gas, and the man brought me back to my car, where I filled my tank just enough to drive the truck to a gas station to fill up completely. Then I went straight home. This was a real-life learning experience for me, that there are bad people out there who will try to take advantage of you when you're in a vulnerable spot. But there are also good people, like the man who helped me. I live in a pretty basic suburban town on Long Island, New York. My girlfriend Valerie and I recently started renting a small house, perfect for 2 to 4 people. We have a decent-sized backyard, and our house is on a very quiet street. One side of our house has a water drainage basin, as the county calls it, which is just a bunch of trees surrounding a sump. On the other side is our neighbor Neil, who lives with his wife. They're a bit older, in their 60s, and quiet. Then directly across the street is a little patch of woods that's in front of another water drainage basin. So for people who like privacy out front, our house is perfect. But then there's the backyard. Neil's house is blocked off by some bushes that the landlord planted years ago, so besides the house directly behind us over the fence, there are no other houses that could see into the yard. However, that one house looking into our backyard was all it took to genuinely make Valerie and I uncomfortable. As I'm writing this, it's currently the fall, so we've been doing fall cleanup the past few weeks in the front and backyard. I started noticing that any time we were out there, there were these two people standing at the upstairs window of the house behind us. It was a middle-aged man and woman. When I'd look up to that window, they'd keep looking and watching me. It got really uncomfortable to the point we pretended not to notice it, but we could only stomach doing this for so long. The leaves kept falling day by day, and the fall cleaning would need to continue. Valerie wouldn't want to be in the yard anymore because she was getting so creeped out at those two people who would watch us out the window without fail. So one foggy day while raking, I looked up at the window and once again, the two were standing at the big rectangular window. I decided to wave at them to see if they'd wave back. After a few seconds of smiling and waving, they didn't move. No reaction, but I could feel their stares and I could see their eyeballs looking at me. I turned away from the window and tried to continue raking, but after sneaking a peek back at the window a couple of minutes later and seeing them still there, I felt too awkward and weird being out there. I went inside. Valerie said we should go over and introduce ourselves. At first, I was hesitant about that, but I was persuaded to walk around the block with her to that house and ring the bell. We expected one of those people at the window to answer the door, but instead, the door cracked open just enough to see half of a person's head. It didn't look like either of those people who were always at the window. It was also super dark in the house to the point that it looked incredibly ominous and uncanny staring at half of that person's face. This guy looked a lot younger, like in his 22-year-old. Valerie and I tried to be friendly and introduce ourselves. The guy seemed very closed off though and not interested in speaking. He had a very, "what do you need" type of attitude about him. When I asked if he lives with anyone else here, like his parents, he said no. I mentioned the man and woman who were always at the window upstairs, and the guy on the other side of the door said he doesn't know who I'm talking about. Valerie and I felt really unsettled, so we just left. But weirdly, as we walked down the walkway back to the sidewalk, I noticed the guy behind the door was still peering half of his face through the cracked open door. I'm sure he watched us walk away until we were out of sight. That interaction was weirder and creepier than we were expecting. When we got back home, I went upstairs to our room. The upstairs of our house is only our master bedroom and the bathroom. It has two windows. One of the windows looks over to that house over the fence. I looked out the window to see those two people looking out the window again, and even at this distance, I felt like they were staring right at me. I shut the blinds and went down to tell Valerie. We agreed it was time to plant some arborvitaes to block their window from view. The only problem is it's already the fall, and it's too late to plant any kind of trees. We have to make it through winter. After a few days of not looking outside the bedroom window or going into the backyard, one night we heard a strange knocking sound from downstairs. I told Valerie to wait in bed while I went downstairs. The knocking got louder, and I quickly discovered it wasn't the sound of knocking on one of the doors, but rather on the glass of one of the backyard windows. The blinds of it were, of course, shut because we didn't want those creepy people looking into our living room at night. I approached it, and yes, it was 100% a fist knocking on the glass. I considered saying, "Who's there?" but I froze, and I was too scared. Instead, I flicked on the backyard light, and then the knocking stopped. I didn't even want to look out the window or door. I kept the light on and then went back upstairs to my room where I told Valerie about the creepy knocking. But I claimed that I chased whoever it was away. I exaggerated in fear of sounding like a coward. I also didn't want her to worry. We both imagined it to have been something to do with that house though. Nothing has happened since, but I'll have to update throughout the winter. Update, it's been 2 weeks, and we haven't seen those people at the window ever since. But last night, we heard yelling and screaming from that house. I had to open our window, and it became clear there were muffled yells coming from that house. The fact that we heard it through 2 sets of closed windows just goes to show how loud the yelling was. Then, out of nowhere, it just stopped and went quiet. We almost called the police, but ultimately didn't. I'll update again if anything else happens, but we're really getting creeped out here now. When I was in middle school, I was desperate for friends. I tried to talk to anyone that would let me sit with them, but nobody ever seemed to like me enough to keep me around, or they would just be mean to me. That's why, when the 2 prettiest, most popular girls in school, Azure and Alita, invited me to a sleepover with them, I was thrilled. I had tried sitting with them at lunch a few times before, but they always told me to go away because they were busy talking about something that wasn't my business. Then, on the last day of school one year, they both came up to me while I was sitting by myself. They said they really wanted to hang out with me over the summer but didn't want other people to see us hanging out together while we were still in school. Even as a naive and lonely middle schooler, I knew that was a severely underhanded invite, but I accepted it with enthusiasm anyway. I would take what I could get, and they knew it. Of course, my mom was just glad I was finally starting to hang out with other kids, and she gladly gave me permission to go, especially when I said that Azure's mom offered to serve all 3 of us dinner. When I got there, it was about 8 p.m., and I was already dressed in my pajamas. Alita and Azure were still fully dressed. When I asked if we were still going to have dinner together, Azure said that they had just finished eating right before I got there. Then Alita said I didn't need to eat so much anyway. They were already putting me down, but I wanted to be friends with them so badly that I let them do it. After I said hi to Azure's mom, who was already wine drunk and ready for us to not be her problem anymore, we all went up to Azure's room upstairs. It was a Jack and Jill style bedroom with her own bathroom and another bedroom on the other side. I asked Azure who was in the other room, but she snapped at me and said it was her older sister and told me not to be so nosy. I apologized profusely, but they just told me to be quiet because my voice was annoying. Azure had a bunch of awesome stuff in her room, from Taylor Swift posters to expensive makeup and giant stuffed animals, things that my mom couldn't afford to get me. But as much as I wanted to ask her about it, I knew she wouldn't like that, so I just looked at the floor. We started to play Truth or Dare, which Alita and Azure used to mine all sorts of information about me, including who I had a crush on and how much money my parents made. I told them everything honestly, only for them to laugh in my face every time. Whenever I asked them to tell the truth about something, they made up a bunch of ridiculous stuff that I knew was a lie, but of course, I wasn't going to call them out on it. When I finally got sick and tired of having to spill all my beans, I told them to dare me to do something. As soon as I said that, Alita and Azure looked at each other with the most wicked smiles, like they had been waiting for me to say that the whole time. Then Azure dared me to go into the bathroom and play the Bloody Mary game. I didn't know what it was at the time, and when I admitted this, they both screamed in disbelief that I didn't know who Bloody Mary was. They explained it to me and said I had to do it or I would have to leave the sleepover. I wanted to stay, so I stepped inside the bathroom. Azure and Alita lit a candle in front of the mirror, then they turned off the lights and shut the door. "You have to say it loud and clear," Azure teased me from the other side. "If you don't, we'll know." I was shaking. I had no idea what would happen. Was this Bloody Mary someone that could really be summoned? Would she really kill me if she came? I didn't know, but the only thing that pushed me forward was the need to be accepted and the belief that things like ghosts didn't exist. I looked at myself in the mirror, took a deep breath, and said, "Bloody Mary," 3 times slowly. For a moment, nothing happened. I looked behind my reflection, and there was nothing, until I saw a woman crawling out of the bathtub behind me. I screamed and turned around, and I realized it was real. There was a real bloody woman sitting in the shower. Her skin was gray, like she was dead, and her clothes were torn up. But her eyes were open, and she was looking right at me. Slowly, the woman stepped out of the tub and started walking toward me. I was so petrified I couldn't move. I wanted to, but it was like my legs had turned to stone. With every step she took, she left a trail of blood. Soon, she was right in front of me. I screamed again, but she grabbed me by the throat and lifted me up to my tiptoes. She opened her mouth and revealed a gaping jaw full of blood and blackness, inching toward my neck like she was going to take a bite out of it. I couldn't maintain control of myself, so in that moment, I peed my pants. But then, at the last second, the door swung open and the lights turned on. "What's going on in here?" Azure asked. "Why are you screaming?" I could barely get a word out through my stuttering teeth, but I managed what I could. "Bloody Mary was here," I said. "She was right in front of me. I saw her, and it was real. She grabbed me and everything, and she tried to kill me." Alita and Azure said, almost in unison, "What?" They looked all around the bathroom, but of course, she was gone. "Stop acting crazy," said Alita. "You're just begging for attention." "Honestly, it's kind of embarrassing," Azure snickered and agreed. "Wait, did you pee yourself?" "That's disgusting," Alita exclaimed. "Oh my God, so yeah, actually, I think if you're going to act like that, you just have to leave." "What? Why?" I asked in disbelief. But before I knew it, Azure and Alita dragged me out of the bathroom and pushed me down the stairs, then threw all my stuff at me. I crawled to Azure's mother, a sobbing mess, and begged her to call my mom. Based on the look in her eyes and the way she sighed, I think she was very close to just letting me cry myself to sleep on the ground. But thankfully, she had the basic decency to call my mother so I could get out of that awful house. I never fully explained to my mother what happened, except for the fact that they were so mean that I cried. I hid the bruises from being pushed down the steps, and I wore turtlenecks for the next few weeks to hide the bruises on my neck. That was how my summer vacation began that year. Needless to say, I never left the house again until school was back in session. As for Bloody Mary, Azure and Alita's gaslighting was so effective on me that I honestly believed she existed for over 2 years after that. Until one day, I told this story to my first real friend in high school, and they explained to me the obvious truth that it was just Azure's older sister in a convincing costume. I'm 18 years old and going to be a freshman in college this September. This past July, my friend Zelda held a pool party in her backyard as a sort of graduation party, minus any of her family being around because her parents were away. She often has the house to herself, so her parents' house is the go-to spot for a lot of hangouts. She invited like 100 people from our grade, There had to be upwards of 150 people there at the night's peak. I was one of the first to show up with my friend Jonah because we're close with Zelda, so we wanted to help out a little bit. By the time people started showing up, everyone congregated slowly from the kitchen and living room to outside in the backyard by the pool. Some people brought their bathing suits and jumped into the pool, others just jumped in their underwear, and then, of course, most others just stood around the pool. She has a huge backyard. At a certain point, so many people were at the party that it was clear as day people were bringing friends from other schools because we didn't know everyone there. Zelda was getting mad because she made it clear she didn't want randoms. In fact, unfamiliar people seemed to be just barging through the gate, not even accompanied by people from our school or grade. There wasn't much we could do, though. The party was already too crazy to easily control. Zelda did throw in our class group chat not to bring any more randoms or they'd be asked to leave. The problems seemed to slow down after that. At around 1 a.m., the police came to the house and had to shut down the party due to multiple complaints from neighbors, so the music was turned off, and 99% of the guests were asked to leave. Mostly everyone cleared out except a few close friends, including some of Zelda's girlfriends, Letitia and I, and a few other guy friends. We helped do some cleaning, like picking up all the empty cans and bottles. Eventually, it was just 4 of us left there. I'm talking at like 3 a.m., if not later. Since it was hot outside, we migrated to the inside of the house in the air conditioning, where we were just chilling in the living room, continuing to drink. Then we all heard a distinct crack from upstairs, and we went silent. Zelda was the first to ask what was that as we all looked at each other with these wide-eyed, half-laughing, half-freaked-out faces. Letitia and I left, teasing Zelda that someone was upstairs in her room, and she begged us to stop and check it out, so we did. We went upstairs to Zelda's room. It was clear. We then went to the guest room that used to be her older brother's room, and we found one of our friends, Eudora, passed out in the bed. We went downstairs to tell her that Eudora was upstairs and knocked out. I guess that gave her a sigh of relief. Looking back, that didn't much explain a sound coming from upstairs if he was knocked out in bed, though, but we weren't exactly the most coherent at that moment. Eventually, Zelda and her friend Mia went to sleep in her room, Letitia fell asleep on the couch, and I went to her parents' bed. None of us were okay to drive anywhere. I can't remember how much time passed before I remember one of the girls screaming in the next room over, and then both of them. It was a heart-dropping kind of moment, but I didn't know if they were messing around with each other at first or not, but I realized pretty quickly the screams were way too real. I burst out of the bed and went to Zelda's room and opened the door. The lights were out. I could barely see anything except for the 2 girls huddled up, hugging each other in the corner of the room, basically curled up on the floor. I saw what they were screaming at. There was a tall person in the opposite corner of the room, on the other side of the bed from them. I saw him looking at me in the doorway. I yelled at the girls to run, and they did. There was so much yelling that even Eudora woke up and came out as the girls ran downstairs, screaming that the man was touching their feet. We followed, but looking back with 3 guys there, we regrettably didn't try to overpower that one man. We all left the house, and one of us called the police, waiting by the neighbor's house with the neighbors, possibly the same ones who called the cops on the party. We didn't see the man leave the front door ever, and after police searched the house and couldn't find him, that meant he left through the back door. None of us recognized who that man was. It was probably an older man who knew Zelda somehow that snuck into the house during the commotion of the party and thought Zelda would be alone after the party. It's some sick, scary stuff. Whether we could have overpowered him or not, we'll never know because we don't know if he was armed. This ongoing issue started about a month ago, but let me provide some context first. I'm 25 years old and I live with my parents. My family is not well off and never has been, and pretty much all the money I make goes into supporting the household. My relationship with my parents is not the best. We bicker quite often, and whenever I'm not working or hanging with friends, I tend to stick to myself. I don't want to write a hard luck story or anything like that, but I've had a tough time growing up. Fitness has always been my go-to escape. I see it as a healthy way to get my mind off personal burdens while also providing a good excuse to leave the house. There's a park about a 20-minute drive from my house that has a workout facility with bars for pull-ups, dips, and other calisthenic exercises. During the summer months, I like to go there to work out, as nature helps calm my mind. I like to go at nighttime because, since it's a public park, it tends to get busy during the day. So, one night while my parents were arguing, I decided to slip out of the house to go work out. It was an extremely hot summer night, probably 85 degrees. I remember breathing in the humid air as I walked from my doorstep to the beat-up white Corolla sitting in our driveway. I started the rickety engine and rolled down the windows as the warm summer breeze flowed through my hair. I arrived at the park and exited my car. I was the only car in the lot. It was probably 10 or 11 p.m. The park was completely empty at this time. The beautiful scenery mixed with the steamy air to create a soothing atmosphere, which is another reason why I like this park so much. It sits on top of a hill that overlooks the downtown area of my city, which always adds pleasant and sentimental emotions to my evenings. Anyway, I started a set on the pull-up bar. I wasn't really counting the repetitions. When I work out, I just do it till failure, then take a break and do it a couple more times. It was somewhere between my sets when I took a break to loosen up my arms. Before I got back on the bar, though, an indescribable feeling came over me, and a subconscious urge forced me to turn my head around. Standing literally a foot away from my face was a tall, beaten-looking man. I actually screamed and jumped like 5 feet back. He let out a raunchy, boisterous laugh and apologized, saying he didn't mean to scare me. His appearance and mannerisms were extremely eccentric right off the bat, like he was damn near face to face with me. He clearly had something wrong with him. I asked him why he was so close to me, and he said he lives here. He explained that he sees me working out here all the time and asked me if I could teach him. Now, I'm a very non-confrontational type of person, and especially during a time like that, I really just wanted to be left alone. I awkwardly but politely told him I was just going to do some pull-ups and leave. I hopped back on the bar and continued my set. His words marinated in my mind. He sees me here all the time. I felt the gaze of his eyes burning the back of my neck, but like I said, I'm very non-confrontational. While he did make me increasingly uneasy, I didn't really know what to say or do about it. But then something really weird happened. Right as I was about to finish my set, I heard him mutter my full name. My blood instantly turned cold as I jumped off the bar and slowly backed away. I said a shaky, "What?" He didn't respond and instead just stared at me with this crazed, wide-eyed smile. I thought I might have been hearing things, that's how bizarre it was. I started to get an awful feeling in my gut, like something bad was about to happen. Without another word, I decided to quickly walk back to my car and leave. I felt that man staring at me while I retreated, and thankfully he didn't follow me. Before I left the park, though, I took one last look and saw him hanging from the bar, attempting to do a pull-up. I watched as he grabbed the bar, tried to pull himself up, and then failed and tried again in the exact position I was previously in. I swiftly left the park without looking back. The entire ride back, I questioned myself. Did he really say my name? Was I hallucinating? I tried to forget about it, and eventually, I did. I woke up early the next day to get to work. I work construction and have to wake up very early before my parents, so I was the first one to notice the unmarked envelope sitting at my front door. It was addressed to me. I picked it up and figured I'd read whatever was inside whenever I had the chance. It was another sweltering hot summer day, and I took my lunch break early to cool down. I sat in my car while eating my pre-made sandwich and decided to open the envelope. I didn't really know what to expect, but never in a million years did I think I'd find 10 printed photos of me. They were all unknowingly taken. One was of me in my car, one was of me at work, one was of me exercising at the park. I instantly remembered that creepy man from the night before and started to feel uncontrollably nauseous. I stared in disbelief as I flipped through the rest of them. One was of my house, and the worst of all was a photo of me sleeping, taken from outside my window. I nearly choked on my food as tears rolled down my cheeks. I felt unsafe. I told my boss a serious issue popped up, and I left work right away. He wasn't happy with me, but I didn't care. I took a picture of the photos and drove directly to the police station. I gave the police the photos and explained my encounter at the park. I described the man to them, and they said they would look into it. I told my parents about it too, and for the first time in a long time, I actually got some sympathy out of them. More things started happening, though. A couple of nights later, at like 3 a.m., I awoke to knocks at the door. I didn't open it, assuming the worst. One day, I found a sticky note pasted to my car window with a heart drawn in Sharpie. I went back to the police to report this, and they said they would open up a stalker investigation. I haven't heard back from them yet. I figured it's hard to build a case without having concrete evidence. This happened about a month ago, and I've been on high alert ever since. My parents are looking for a new home, which is already tough given our financial situation. I'll update if anything further happens, but until then, I'll continue to sleep with one eye open. When I was 18, my friend Dash, who was a big goofball, came over to chill in our basement as he often would during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand, and I was eating Wendy's when he said we should check out that creepy little cemetery across town. It was the most random idea ever, and I even told him that. Still, we had no school the next day, and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if one should even call it a regular cemetery. It's just a small plot of land with maybe 100 tombstones at most. The tombstones were very archaic looking, and any time we'd pass, there would be no signs of anyone having come to visit within the last decade. The site probably dated back centuries and had this super creepy vibe to it because it was closed off by a Gothic metal fence and surrounded by woods on two sides, the road on one, and some old abandoned building on the other. Everything about it just gave scary vibes. It took a little persuading, but Dash managed to get me to want to check it out too. Ironically, it was a very cloudy, reddish kind of day, conveniently adding to the mood. Dash pulled up his Honda to the side of the road. I told him to pull up more so it wasn't obvious. This was a low-traffic road, so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few hundred feet down the road, and we got out and cut through the woods so that any potential passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the little cemetery. Hopping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Dash kind of took the lead on this since it was mainly his venture. He led us through the eerie little plot of land, and we looked at the archaic tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century. The writing on some of them was illegible at that point. I know it sounds super dumb and cliché, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched constantly. I started looking around the surrounding woods. I told Dash how creepy this was. "I know," he replied. Still with the feeling of being watched, I looked at the abandoned building next to the cemetery, at one of the windows. For a brief moment, I knew I saw someone standing at the window, even through the fog, smudge, and dirt on the glass. But they casually either ducked or walked away from the window. I told Dash we were being watched by someone in that building, and he turned to look at it as well. Then he went to look for the entrance to it. I told him, "Don't." I said we should just leave before we get in trouble. I stayed still by the tombstone he was looking at while he walked around a building, and then he found a way in. He called me over, but I stayed put. I heard some loud kind of crack, so I looked in that direction, and there was this older man, probably around 55. Gray hair, had on a black raincoat, I believe he was wearing jeans, and he had a mustache, but that's all I really got of him. Then he opened his mouth and screamed. Not just yelled, he screamed, "Get out." He screamed it so loud I thought I saw birds fly away from being startled. Just like that, I started to feel lightheaded, and suddenly everything went dark. The next thing I remember was waking up to being dragged in the woods. I freaked out, thinking I was being kidnapped, but when I turned and got up, I saw it was just Dash. Dash was freaking out about something. He told me to follow him and run back to the car, so I didn't ask questions. As we ran through the woods, I heard something close behind me, and when I turned, I realized we were being followed by someone. So I ran even faster. We got to his Honda, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. When Dash was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of freaky dolls with buttons for eyes. He didn't get to see anything else in the building because he heard the old man scream at me outside. He came running to find me passed out on the floor, and he saw the old man slowly walking over to me. He started to drag me away from the old man and into the woods. He actually literally picked me up and threw me over the fence to get me out. I quickly came back to consciousness, and that's when we ran. I had only fainted one time in my life, and it was at that moment. I don't know why I fainted, but it happening at a graveyard with some kind of satanic ritual building right next to it makes it that much stranger. Foreign off this chick that was a little unstable to say the least. She'd probably kill me if she heard what I was about to say using her real name, so for my own sake, I'm going to refer to her as Jane. To make a long backstory short, she came from a messed up family, and her dad was sort of at the center of a lot of her problems. When he finally died, she told me she went to the funeral just so she could find out where he was buried. A few days later, in the middle of the night, Jane called to ask me to take her to the cemetery to smash his gravestone. Although that was something I would never do to anyone, no matter how much I hated them, I could understand why Jane would want to do something like that against her father's memory. She didn't have a license, so I picked her up and we drove to the cemetery. When I parked the car in the visitor lot outside, she pulled a hammer and a handful of grocery bags out of her purse. She said she just wanted to go in, smash it up into a bunch of small pieces, bag it up, and leave. Obviously, I knew that we were breaking at least one law by trespassing into the cemetery after dark, but this was all right with me. I just told her I would keep an eye out for anyone in the area while she did what she needed to do. On that note, We got out and hurried over to the grave. Jane knew exactly where it was, so it took us no time at all, but I was still extremely nervous about the whole thing. It wasn't just the threat of being arrested, but the vibe of the cemetery itself. I really felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, like we were disturbing all those dead people by marching through in the middle of the night. I kept my hat on straight and tried to give Jane space. At first, she spent a minute kneeling on top of the relatively fresh grave, whispering a bunch of curses and crying just from the sheer intensity of whatever emotion she was feeling. But then, without warning, she started screaming and striking the headstone. The first time caught me so off guard that it sent chills through my whole body. I spun around and was about to tell her to quiet down, but at first glance, I knew she wasn't going to hear me. She was going absolutely berserk on this stone, screaming and wailing at the top of her lungs. Each time she hit it with the hammer, only a small piece would break off. I realized we were going to be there for a while if it went on at this pace, and she was making so much god-awful noise I was terrified that somebody in the nearby neighborhood would hear us. I also thought about how blood-curdling it would feel to be walking by the graveyard and hear Jane's banshee-like shrieking in the distance, and to be unsure if she was like a ghost or a serial killer or something. My instincts set in and I became more concerned about my own safety than anything else. Here was this completely unhinged, crazy person violently thrashing her way through a mixture of grief and unhealed trauma, seeing red with total tunnel vision, and I was alone with her, surrounded by darkness and dead people. I was worried that if I got near her, she would forget it was me and think I was the ghost of her father and start trying to kill me or something, so I backed away. However, it wasn't long before the deep-seated rage within Jane started to wear off a bit and she became tired. She then stopped and looked at the progress she had made. 2/3 of the headstone was still intact, but she was already exhausted. That's when she looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw the look of unveiled insanity in Jane's eyes. I'd always known Jane had a few screws loose, but this was next-level crazy. All her movements were sudden and jarring. She stood and shoved the hammer into my chest, telling me to take it and finish the job. I protested at first, not wanting to get roped further into what I thought was Jane's thing she needed to do, but as soon as I did, she grabbed me by the ears and yanked my head down so that my face was less than an inch away from hers. She then screamed so loud that it practically ruptured my eardrums. She demanded that I break the gravestone for her, or she'd use the hammer on me and bury my body next to her father's. Seeing that I was in too deep to back out, I reluctantly accepted the task and committed myself to making short work of it. Of course, I was stronger than Jane, but I wasn't nearly as uninhibited. What happened next, though, made me all the more sure that I shouldn't have tried to fight her or anything. As I was hacking away at the stone, managing to break off bigger pieces, she was standing behind me laughing like an absolute maniac. She was cheering me on the way I imagine a witch would encourage another witch to their first human sacrifice. I tried my best to ignore her, but it was impossible. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that she had pulled out a knife, which sent another chill down my spine. Before I knew it, she knelt behind me and straddled my back, throwing her arms over my shoulders, whispering little pure evil into my ears. I froze up and stopped swinging the hammer because I didn't want to hit her. She told me I was almost done. Then she did something I'll never forget. Both of her hands were out in front of me, one of which held the knife right before my eyes. She put the blade to her palm and sliced it open, creating a fountain of blood which quickly spilled down her wrist. Then she whispered some kind of satanic blessing in tongues and smeared her bloody hand over my face, from my forehead down to my chin, then across my throat until she finally rested her hand with a vice grip at the base of my neck. She asked me if I could taste the blood, and I said I could. She took pleasure in this, and then she finally let go of me to stand on the grave again. Then she screamed out at the top of her lungs that these would be the final tears she would ever cry over her father. As she looked up into the night sky with her eyes open, she put her hand up to the moon and clenched her fist, squeezing the wound to form drops of blood which fell down upon her eyes and face. I watched this whole thing, stunned out of my mind, until she looked back at me with her face full of bloody tears and growled at me to finish the job. Of course, I was thoroughly terrified of Jane by this point and I was ready to leave. I just did as she said. At last, when the whole thing was smashed to bits, I convinced Jane that we needed to go. Thankfully, she seemed ready, but the entire time we were picking up the pieces and bagging them, she was giggling. When it was all cleaned up, we ran back to my car, somehow going through this whole entire ordeal without anyone seeing us or calling the cops on us. I drove Jane back home and I dropped her off. As she got out of my car, she tried to drag me out to spend the night with her. I'd been waiting for that night for months, but by then I knew where that would go. I knew it would be no good for me, so I made up some excuse about having to work the next day in the morning. I cut off all contact and I've been avoiding her out of fear ever since. Out of all my strange experiences, this is probably the most compelling I had simply because I was not alone when it happened. I was not with just the average kind of people either. I'll put in as much detail exactly as I remembered them, so this may be long. I can't mention the name of the company I work for to protect my job, but it's one of the largest telcos in the Philippines, which is synonymous with the word world. I currently work as one of the senior IT network and server engineers there. I usually get assigned to work on priority repairs on various cell sites and server data centers, mostly in far-flung provinces. This happened in mid-December of 2018 in Nueva Vizcaya, mountainous province in the northern region of the Philippines. It was a priority service call, Sarah T1, the highest of priorities wherein even the CEO of the company received status updates since the cell site in question also services various military communications devices. As soon as I got into the office, I was dispatched immediately, carrying with me various equipment to replace the existing ones at the cell site. It was a 6-hour drive from Manila. I was asked to go to a specific meeting point in the town nearest the cell site to rendezvous with my escort, an 8-member team from the Philippines 1st Army Scout Ranger Regiment. The area of the cell site is a place where the local communist movement, the New People's Army, is highly active. Apparently, the NPA carried out an operation early in the morning of that day, which caused some of the damage to the equipment. The team I met up with was led by one of my former high school classmates. Let's call him Lieutenant Knox. He had even specifically asked for me as he knew I worked for the telco. He had his men transfer the equipment to their truck, and we began to travel to the cell site. It was already dark at the time. During the long uphill ride, Lieutenant Knox and I did some catching up when they suddenly received a call. I don't understand military speak, so I could not tell exactly what we talked about, but he updated us accordingly, saying that a village on the way to the cell site requested assistance with a possible NPA member harassing a household. Apparently, the man had climbed up on the roof of someone's house, and he was still in the area. Being the nearest, Lieutenant Knox responded that his team would be handling it, so we drove towards the area, keeping the headlights turned off. The countryside, especially the poorer places, are very dark. Soldiers aren't allowed to smoke at night in places like these since the light from their cigarettes could be clearly seen even from afar, giving away their position. It was that dark here. I was hesitant since I'm not exactly a soldier, but he brushed it off, saying it would be a good chance for me to become a soldier for at least one night. Lieutenant Knox, I can say, is a battle-hardened junior officer. He's been to a number of dangerous situations and has fought in many encounters, both high-profile and low-key. He's the type of guy to jump in quickly then ask questions later. I remember him being like that even in school, a very cocky individual, but not entirely without cause, especially now that he was in the army. He even received a medal recently, although I wasn't sure for what. Either way, he said, we're going in. It's part of the job. Now, you have to understand the Philippine Army usually does the police work in these areas where communists, Muslim insurgents, or bandits are active. And when you send in the scouts, the best our military has to offer, you can get an idea of the kind of situation it places in. Even other countries recognized the abilities of the Philippine Scout Rangers, all the more so in this case since these scouts came from the 1st Regiment. They're the best the scouts have to offer, from what I was made to understand. We got to the place a little over 5 minutes after, with me still having second thoughts. Dude, make up your mind. Either you shadow me or I leave you in the truck. But if you stay here, you're gonna be free dinner for the commies. Can't spare you a babysitter for this one, he explained to me. So he made the choice easier for me. I didn't have plans to be abducted. I was already soiling myself, basically not cut out for this stuff. I just wanted to repair the cell site and go home, but I did have plans to get his wife to get back at him for this. Here, he said, handing me a loaded 9mm and 2 clips. I know you're used to this one, and the safety's on. I sat there thinking I wasn't getting paid enough for this job, and I recalled my company insurance policy. It doesn't even cover sports-related injuries, let alone anything you'd see in a firefight. But I didn't have time to dilly-dally, so I stuck with my friend instead of waiting for someone to drag me into the woods and getting held for ransom, which no one's gonna pay for, let's face it. The plan was for 6 of his men to break off into 3 pairs to surround the house in question. Me, Knox, and his sniper Mason were to head over to the water tower about 60 meters out. I guess he planned to snipe the guy and have his men stand by on the ground in case the sniper missed. As we trekked over to the water tower, he told me, "You're too stiff, man. You're wearing dark clothes. No one's gonna see you. We'll be in and out in 10 minutes. You're a VIP, and that's why I came and had my sergeant stay with the platoon at the cell site, so don't worry so much." I didn't know VIPs had to join in responding to calls like this, but the scouts were undermanned as it was already, and that's why my friend needed to multitask at the moment. When we got to the water tower, Private First Class Mason immediately positioned himself, and Lieutenant Knox sat beside him while I positioned myself behind. At that time, I was thinking to myself, well, yeah, this wasn't so bad. I'm far and safe away from that area. But then I heard Mason say, "Sir, you need to see this." Knox brought out some type of binoculars, I guess they call it an NV scope. I couldn't see his reaction because it was dark, but he was silent for a moment as he put down the binoculars. "What in the world," was all Knox could whisper. He then turned to me and asked me to look at the direction he pointed and to tell him what I saw. I was initially concerned, thinking that there were more NPAs now and that we were outnumbered. A reaction like this from a seasoned scout didn't exactly paint a nice picture in my mind. But what I saw was definitely something that will probably haunt me for the rest of my life. I wish I hadn't taken those binoculars at all. I even wish I saw more communists instead of what I did see. The image was green, and I saw someone on the roof of a house. It was a man. He didn't have a shirt on, nor did he have any weapons on him. He had very short hair or a shaved head, and he was barefoot. He had jeans on, but the lower part was wrapped from what I could tell. He had dark skin and seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed his arms, which were very, very long. His hands were almost past his knees, and his fingers were also very long and pointed. The fingers were longer than normal and had tips that looked like long nails or even claws. The first thing on my mind was, this can't be real. "Sir," Mason said, "it's moving." I didn't expect what happened next. The thing, whatever it really was, looked right at our group. Even from that distance, it was unmistakable. He or it had its head turned in our direction, and its eyes were solid white. Eyeshine, like a cat's eyes. Right then, I nearly dropped the binoculars. Had it not been strapped to my wrist, it probably would have fallen straight through the grated flooring of the water tower. Knox looked to me as if asking what I saw, and all I could say was, "It looked at us, man. It knows we're up here." Almost at the same time, Mason begged, "Sir, your orders." My friend gave the order to put 2 in its head. I think the first shot hit the mark because we heard a scream echo throughout the valley. It sounded like a mix of a high-pitched male screaming and a cornered animal crying out in pain. I'm not sure how to describe it beyond that, but it was the first time I'd ever heard such a sound. I'm sure all of us heard it because of how loud the sound was. Mason never let out a second shot. I don't know if he did so on purpose or if he was caught off guard, but we then heard automatic rifle shots in the distance. Knox immediately told us to go. Mason went down the ladder first at a ridiculous rate, then me, then Knox. Back on the ground, we ran over to the house. These guys were fast and easily outran me. Knox had to basically drag me along the way so I wouldn't be left behind. Honestly, I was reluctant to run where we were headed. I wasn't as hardcore as these scouts. I could barely even keep myself from soiling myself. There was still someone firing in the direction towards the tree line. When we got to the house, near the front, we found one of the soldiers sitting against the wall. His buddies seemed to be applying first aid. His left forearm had a long and nasty gash that leaked fiercely onto the soil. I wanted to vomit. He reported to Knox that something jumped up from the roof and landed right on top of him. It was just after Mason fired. While he didn't get a good look at the attacker due to the darkness, he specifically refused to call it human. Even his buddy didn't think it was human at all. The other 4 soldiers got back to us, saying that the assailant got away. Knox decided to get to know the people in the house, and we found out that a young couple lived there. In fact, the woman was 7 months pregnant. They had texted their local village official, who in turn requested the military to check since, again, they suspected it was an NPA. The 3 of us, Knox, Mason, and me never told anyone, even the couple, what we saw that night. We simply stated it was a machete-swinging communist trying to rob the couple. After all, the NPAs were known to resort to banditry. A while after that, we finally made our way to the cell site. I simply couldn't stop shaking. When we got there, I immediately got to doing my necessary repairs. Knox and Mason stuck to their story when the rest of their platoon asked about it regarding the recent encounter. They never mentioned anything about the man's description or the strange animal sound. After working an all-nighter and making sure the cell site was operational, Knox and his men minus the injured one took me back to the town where I had parked my car as soon as daybreak came. As his men loaded the damaged equipment I replaced into my car, Knox talked to me. At first, he was trying to joke around, saying I could probably enlist in the regular army now since I had some first-hand experience. I went along with this for a moment, hoping to forget about the strange incident. But inside, I was utterly horrified. However, before I was able to drive away, Knox said to me, "Dude, Mason, we saw the same thing you did. You know what it was, don't you?" I never responded, but inside, I think I knew what he was talking about. The aswang, a mythical creature from Filipino folklore, the stuff of a Filipino child's nightmares. The description, the sound, it was the only thing that made sense explaining what the thing was during the Spanish era from the 1500s to 1890. These creatures were said to be once human who were supposedly blessed by the moon priestesses of old called Baba even, so that the people could have the power to fight the Spanish colonizer who had done them wrong. It is said that the Spaniards decided to persecute these priestesses for witchcraft, then spread tales that aswangs attacked locals and foreigners alike. The aswang is a creature said to be able to shape-shift into either a human or an animal, but it is never able to correctly imitate one or the other. As a human, it has leathery black skin and disproportionate limbs. As an animal, like a cat or dog, it is always black and 3 times the normal size. It can neither speak nor do animal calls, it can only grouch out or scream. They usually eat the flesh of recently deceased humans and animals, but have a strange preference for the ill or pregnant women. Pregnant women like the one in the village. They can never become human again, and being in a swang is hereditary. No one will turn if attacked by one, although the wounds they inflict are often fatal. This is what Knox and I were both thinking, but I'd always considered it just that, just folklore. Yet there's no denying that what we saw that night wasn't human. I have never been back to the general area after, while Knox and his team had been dispatched to the south dealing with ISIS members. Before I posted this, I asked them about that night. It's hard to imagine a soldier of his caliber believing in such tales. I find it even harder as I write this to believe what I saw was real. But no matter how hard I try to come up with an explanation, I couldn't, except for the idea that it truly was an aswang, the legend passed down by our forefathers. Knox said to me in reply, "I told you before, you and I both know what the thing was." I go with what I see, and most of the time, I don't have the luxury of time to doubt whatever is in front of me. I don't know if I'll ever know the truth, and I can't be sure if I even want to know. It was a Memorial Day weekend, so my friend group rented a lakefront house for the weekend 3 hours away from home. It was cheap because it was in the middle of nowhere in North Carolina. It was Callista, Cara, Zelda, Mia, Cheryl, and myself. We all piled into Cheryl's truck. I was the one to find this place on Airbnb, and what was most appealing about it was the big deck with the hot tub on it that overlooked the lake. There was also a fire pit right by the water with a bunch of Adirondack chairs around it. Everything about it seemed perfect for a few days and nights of getting wasted with some friends. The Airbnb host told me that when we got to the property, there was a hidden key behind the mailbox to unlock the front driveway gate. The driveway was made of gravel and dirt, and it cut through a small opening in the woods, bringing a slight uphill to a bigger opening where the house was. Cheryl parked the truck right next to the front deck. The deck wrapped around the entire house, which was pretty cool. The first thing I did was walk to the back part of the deck and look at the view of the lake. It was very beautiful and peaceful. Too bad we were about to be blasting music and partying. Right as we were done unpacking, everyone cracked open beers, and we wasted no time letting the weekend begin. We played beer pong, cornhole, barbecued, and blasted music for hours. We were really loud because, as far as we knew, this was the only house around here. It's not like there were any nearby neighbors to complain. The phone connection out there was very spotty, so we really were just living in the moment, socializing with each other, not distracted by social media and whatnot. As it was getting darker and we were sitting by the fire pit, we all got startled when a voice came from the edge of the woods. It was some middle-aged woman with short hair. She started yelling at us to lower the music, so someone lowered the volume of the music. The woman started more or less lecturing us, saying how we out-of-towners always come here, litter in the lake, and create nothing but noise. She seemed like genuine white trash. I apologized on behalf of all of us, and one of the girls asked the woman if she lived nearby and if she could hear the music. The woman responded, still in a yell, that she couldn't even hear herself think. She didn't acknowledge the other question regarding if she lived nearby. Then, she just walked away into the woods, like literally into the dark woods. It was so strange. When we were sure she was out of earshot, we all erupted into laughter. As bizarre as the encounter was, we had to make light of it, but it also did put a slight damper on things considering we thought for sure we were far enough away from any neighboring houses to blast music and be loud. But we continued to drink, and pretty soon that concern was forgotten about, and we got loud again. Some immeasurable amount of time passed before a song ended, and it went quiet for a second, and we heard a voice calling out from the lake. We paused the music and listened, and sure enough, a voice was calling out for help in the middle of the lake. We all looked at each other nervously. I stood up and went to the water and yelled out, "Who's out there? Are you in the water?" The voice called back, "Yes, help." Adrenaline started to kick in. There was a kayak leaned up against the deck by the water with 2 sets of paddles. Cheryl and I agreed to paddle out there in an effort to save whoever was out there. We yelled out at them to keep calling out, but as we got in the water, the calls seemed to get further away no matter how deep we got into the lake. After like 5 to 10 minutes of rowing out to the complete darkness of this lake, calling out repeatedly for that man, we heard it was just utter silence. All we could see were the lights from the house sitting at the edge of the lake, and then just darkness in every other direction. It was only the sound of the light splashes of water and then screams, female screams, coming from the direction of the house. They sounded gut-wrenching, like genuine screams of danger. It sounded like more than one, at least 2 of the girls' screams. We immediately started paddling back, even more panicked now. The screams stopped long before we got back to the shore. We screamed out for our friends, but we checked inside and outside of the cabin, and all 4 of them were gone, vanished without a trace. We tried texting and calling them, but we had no bars, of course. Cheryl's truck was still there, so we took it and drove up the road looking for the nearest neighboring house. We found it, a similar opening in the woods that led up a hill and onto a property where we saw a house with the lights on. We went to ring the doorbell multiple times, but no one ever answered. We went to look through one of the windows in the front, and what we saw sent chills up my spine. We could see clear as day into the living room. There was a lamp on in the corner, and in the middle of the room, somewhat close to the window, was that trashy woman we saw who came and yelled at us before. She was standing still, doing nothing, just facing the window looking out at us. She had a borderline angry-looking expression. We yelled, asking for help, but when she wouldn't move, we were too creeped out to stay there and left. As we got back in the truck, about to drive to another house, my phone started vibrating. It was Mia calling me. Thank God. I picked up and asked her they were and what happened, but I could barely get a word in as Mia said there were 2 men with axes in their hands wearing masks over their heads walking towards them out of the woods, and that's why the girls screamed and they all ran away down the road. One of them was currently on the phone with 911, and they were waiting. It was out in the woods right on the side of the road. It wasn't long after that the call disconnected, and I wasn't able to reach him again. So we waited on the side of the road, not far from the house. When we finally saw flashing lights coming down the road, we waved them down and asked them to help us find our friends first. We drove up the road until we saw our friends come out from the woods, waving their hands. We scooped them up and followed the police back to the house. Once there, we collected all of our belongings as Mia and the girls frantically recounted what they had just gone through. Oddly enough, the Airbnb was not broken into, and none of our stuff was taken. There was no sign of any men with axes. We also told the police about the cries for help in the lake, which I believe prompted a search team to come to the scene. By then, we were already long gone from that place. We never looked back. After much persistence and battling with Airbnb and the host, we got our money back for the stay, well, most of it. None of us could ever figure out this situation, like if it was all a trap. If the calls for help from the lake were linked with the men approaching the house with the axes, and if that woman was also affiliated somehow with this. Was it just to scare us out of there, or were they really going to attack us? I don't know, and I don't care. I just don't do remote places anymore after this, and I know the girls won't either.